Chapter 19 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 19. A whistling youth who lumbered up the path saved Stellamaris. There was nothing about him suggestive of the dragon-slaying and princess-rescuing hero of the fairy tale, nor did he at any time thereafter dream that he played the part of one. But at the sight of him the she-dragon fled, her ultimate purpose unfulfilled. Stella sank quivering on the bench. The knight-errant touched his cloth cap, and, unaccustomed to the company of princesses, lounged in awkward self-consciousness a few yards away, with his hands in his pockets, and pretended to admire the view. Stella, aware of deliverance from physical danger, drank in the unutterable comfort of his presence. After a while he turned and was moving off, when a cry from her checked him. "Please don't go." He advanced a step or two. "Is there anything the matter, miss?" She reflected for a moment. "I came over rather faint," she said. "I don't know whether I can get down to the house alone." She was too proud to confess to fear of the evil woman. The youth offered help. He could easily carry her home. To have carried the mysterious lady of the Channel House would make him the envy of the village. Such aid, however, she declined. "Shall I tell them at the house, miss?" She sprang to unsteady feet. No, don't do that. See, I can walk. You go in front, and if I want you, I'll tell you." The youth, somewhat disappointed, lounged ahead, and Stella followed with shaking knees. So had she progressed during her early lessons in the art of walking. At the turn of the path Stella held her breath, dreading to come upon the woman, but no woman was in sight. She walked more freely. At last they reached the gate of the Channel House, which the youth held open for her. She thanked him, and once within the familiar shelter of the garden, she sped into the house and up the stairs into her room, where she fell exhausted on the bed. The sensation of physical peril was gone. Of that she felt only the weakness of reaction. But the woman had scorched her soul, shriveled her brain, burnt up the fount of tears. The elfin child of sea foam and cloud lay a flaming horror. They found her there, and saw that she was suffering, and tended her lovingly, with many anxious inquiries. But she could not speak. The touch of ministering hands was torture, almost defilement. All humanity seemed to be unclean. Dr. Ransom, summoned in haste, diagnosed fever, a touch of the sun, and prescribed sedatives. For aught she cared, he might have diagnosed a fractured limb. Of objective things she was barely aware. Figures moved around her like the nightmare shapes of a dream, all abhorrent. She heard their voices dimly. If only they would go, if only they would leave her alone. Her higher mightiness, the nurse, long since relieved of her occupation, was telegraphed for from London. She came and bent over the familiar bed and put her hand on the hot forehead. But Stella withdrew from the once cooling touch and closed her ears to the gentle words, for they seemed to be the touch and the words of the woman with the pale, cruel eyes and the thin lips. All night long she could not sleep, tormented by the presence of the watcher in the room. Outside the night was dark, and a fine rain fell. Within, the lamp of Stellamaris burned in the western window of the sea-chamber. For the first time in her life she longed for the blackness, but she could not speak to the watching shape, and she clenched her teeth. Her brain, on fire, conceived the notion that she was caught in one of the cities of the plain, and far above her floated a little dazzling white cloud, which mockingly invited her to mount on its back and soar with it into the infinite blue. After the dawn had broken, she fell asleep exhausted, and the sun was high when she awoke. The nurse, who had been watching her, bent down. "Are you feeling better, dear?" She smiled at the well-known face. "Yes, higher mightiness," she said. They were the first words she had spoken since the day before. She raised her head, and suddenly memory awoke too, and the horror swooped down upon her like a vast-winged evil bird. She sank again on the pillow, and hid her eyes with her hand. "The light's too strong, dear?" Stella nodded. Words and shapes were now clearly defined. The nurse took her temperature. It was virtually normal. "Must have been a touch of the sun, darling, as the doctor said," remarked the nurse. "But thank heavens you're better. You gave us all such a fright." "I'm sorry," said Stella. "Wasn't my fault." It was a new and baffling Stellamaris that entered the world again. She went about the house silent and preoccupied. Joy was quenched in her eyes, and her features hardened. The lifelong terms of endearment from the two old people met with no response. Their morning and evening kisses she endured passively. They had become to her as strangers, having gradually undergone a curious metamorphosis from the great high excellency and most exquisite auntship of her childhood into a certain Sir Oliver and Lady Blount, personages of bone and flesh of an abominable world in which she could place no trust. One evening, before going upstairs, she picked up a French novel which Sir Oliver had left in the drawing-room. "Don't read that, Stella, dear," said Lady Blount. "Why?" asked Stella. "I don't think it's suitable for young girls." "Is it unclean?" "My darling, what an extraordinary word," said Lady Blount. "Is it unclean?" Stella persisted. "It deals with a certain side of life that is not wholesome for young girls to dwell upon." "You haven't answered my question, Auntie." "The fact that your uncle and I have read it is an answer, dear," said Lady Blount with some dignity. "Then I will read it too," said Stella. She took it up to her room and opened it in the middle, but after a few pages her cheeks grew hot and her heart cold, and she threw the book far out of the window. It was a foul, corrupt world, and all the inhabitants thereof, save herself, gazed upon its foulness and took part in its corruption, not only without a shadow, but positively with zest. In the sane lucidity of her mind, humanity was scarcely less intolerable than in the nightmare of her day and night of horror. To perform an act of ethical judgment, no matter how rough and elementary, one must have a standard. The fact, too, of ethical judgment being inherent in the conditions of human existence implies faultiness in those conditions. In an ideal state of being, such as the evangelical heaven, where there is no faultiness, there can be no possible process of judgment, and therefore no standard whereby to measure right and wrong. If a dweller about the throne were to visit the earth, and even limit his visit to Cheltenham or a New England township, the record of his impressions would be, from our point of view, both grotesque and unjust. He would have no standard, save the infinite purity of the Godhead, and an infinite standard is a contradiction in terms, whereby to measure human actions. He would be a lost and horrified seraph. His opinions would not be a criticism, but an utterly valueless denunciation of life. Stellamaris, for all the imperfections inseparable from humanity, had been a dweller about the throne in her mystical land of illusion. Evil, or the whisper of evil, or the thought of evil, had, by the unwritten law, never been allowed to enter the sea-chamber. She issued therefrom like the unfortunate seraph, without a standard. Her impressions of life, like our worldly point of view, were grotesque and unjust. John was condemned by her unheard. Like the seraph, she was lost and horrified, but unlike the seraph, and here lies the tragedy, for no one of us would break his heart over the horrification of a seraph, as he is only to fly back whence he came to be perfectly happy. Unlike the seraph, Stellamaris was just poor human clay, and she could not fly back to her land of illusion, because it did not exist. It was her fate to lead the common life of imperfect mortals, feeling the common human physical and spiritual pangs, with all the delicate tendrils of her nature inextricably intertwined in human things, and to focus the myriad sensations afforded by the bewildering panorama of life from the false and futile point of view of the seraph. In consequence, she suffered agonies inconceivable, agonies all the more torturing because she could not turn for alleviation to any human being. She shrank from contact with her kind, wandered lonely in the garden, save for the attendance of the old dog, and sat for hours by the window of the sea-chamber, looking with yearning eyes at sea and sky. But no more could sea and sky, cloud and sunset, foam and mist take Stellamaris into their communion. She had put on mortality, and they had cast her out from their elemental sphere. The seagulls flashed their wings in the sun and circled up the cliff and hovered at her window, fixing her with their round yellow eyes, but they were no longer the interpreting angels of wind and wave. The glory of all the mysteries had faded into the light of common day, and the memory of them was only the confused and unrecallable tangle of a dream. Stellamaris cried passionately in her heart, for the days when she had not set foot in the world of men, and when she lived somewhere out there in the salt sea spray, and felt her soul flooded with happiness great and exquisite. But such days could never dawn again. She too had become bone and flesh of an abominable world. Herold came down again and found her white and pinched, with dark lines beneath her eyes. She scarcely spoke, replied in monosyllables, only made such appearances as the conventions of life demanded, and craftily avoided meeting him alone. She was no longer Stellamaris. "What's the matter with her, for pity's sake?" asked Herold. "She's not yet got over that touch of the sun," said Sir Oliver. "This has nothing to do with the sun," Herold declared. Lady Blount sighed. "Perhaps it's a phase. Young girls often pass through it, though earlier, but Stella is different." Herold saw that they did not understand, and, knowing their limitations, felt that even if they were enlightened, they would do more harm than good. As soon as he returned to town, he tracked John to his office. John looked up from proof sheets. "Just back. I nearly ran down yesterday. I should have done so if I hadn't promised my aunt to go to church with her." "You've quite taken to church-going lately," said Herold dryly. John laughed. "It pleases the old soul." "And keeps you in Kilburn," said Herold. "It might be something worse," John growled. Then he banged the table with his fist. "Can you realize what it means to keep away from her? I think of her all day long, and I can't sleep at night for thinking of her. It's idiotic, weak, disgraceful, wicked, any damn thing you like, but it's so." And he glowered up into Herold's face. "I'm eating myself out for her." "What about Stella?" Herold asked. "That you can tell me. You've just come from her. I don't know. I've kept away scrupulously enough, heaven knows. My letters are just footling things. But I've not heard from her for over a week. I waylay the postman and look over my letters like a silly ass of a boy." "Have you told her about your marriage?" "Not yet." Herold drew a deep breath and turned away and pretended to study a proof of the contents bill of the next number of the Review that was pinned against the wall. He had come there to ask that question. He had half expected and wholly hoped for an answer in the affirmative. Stella's knowledge might have accounted for her metamorphosis. "She must be told at once," he said, returning to the table. "Why?" "Because she loves you, you fool!" he exclaimed. "Haven't I seen it? Hasn't she all but told me so herself? And she's told you in some sort of way, and you've made up your mind not to listen. Let me put matters plain before you. She says good-bye to you here in London, and goes home full of happiness, and looks forward to your coming down, invested in a new halo, and to your letters. You know what sort of letters a man writes to the woman he loves. And instead of all that, you never go near her, and you write her footling notes. What do you imagine she's thinking and feeling? What do you think any ordinary decent girl would think and feel in the circumstances?" "Stella isn't an ordinary girl," said John, leaning back in his writing-chair and looking at Herold from beneath his heavy brows. "For that reason she thinks and feels 1,000 times more acutely. She's ill, she's changed, she's the shadow of herself," he went on fiercely, "and it's all through you." He broke off, and as John said nothing, he put both hands on the table and leaned over and looked into John's eyes. "I'll tell you another thing. The whole lot of us have caused her endless misery. We've fed her all her life on lies. God knows how I hated them. Her coming out in the world has been a gradual discovery of them. She's had shock after shock. She hasn't told me, she's too proud, but I know I can read it in her face, in her eyes, in the tone of her voice. And now she's going through the biggest disillusion of all. You." "Do you mean," said John, frowning heavily, "that she thinks I'm a blackguard because I seem— you put the phrase in my head by talking of the ordinary young woman— because I seem to have thrown her over?" "She's wondering whether you are a lie, like most other things, and it's killing her." "What am I to do?" "Tell her straight. You ought to have done so from the first." "If she feels it as deeply as you say, it might kill her outright." "It won't," said Herold. "She's made of metal too fine. But even if it did, it were better so, for she would die knowing you to be an honest man." John put his elbows on the table and tugged at his hair with his big fingers. He could not resent Herold's fiery speech, for he felt that he spoke with the tongue of an archangel. Presently he raised a suffering face. "You're right, Wally. It's got to be done. But I feel as if I'm taking a knife to her." He rose and pushed away the pile of proofs. "All this," said he, "is going to the devil. I've got to work through it over and over again because I can't concentrate my mind on anything." He walked about the room and then came down with both hands on Herold's shoulders. "For God's sake, Wally, tell me that you understand how it has all come about. Heaven knows she has the purest and the highest I've had to give her. I'm a rough, selfish brute, but for all those years she stood to me for something superhuman, a bit of God fallen on the earth, if you like. And then she came out in woman's form and walked about among us. I couldn't help it. Say that you understand." "I can quite understand you falling in love with her," said Herold quietly. "And you'll help me to set me right with her, as far as this damnable matter can be set right?" "You two are dearer to me than anything in life," said Herold. "There is nothing too difficult for me to undertake for you. But whether I succeed is another question." "I wish I were like you," said John. He shook him with rough tenderness and turned away. "God, it isn't the first time I've wished it." "In what way like me?" "You've kept your old high ideals. She's still to you Stellamaris, the bit of God. You haven't wanted to drag her down to flesh and blood, as I have." Herold grew white to the lips and took up his hat and stick. "Never mind about me," he said, steadying his voice. "I don't count. She's all that matters. What are you going to do? See her or write?" "I'll write," said John. Herold went out, carrying with him the memory of words he had spoken to John many years before, words of which afterwards he had been ashamed, for no man likes to think that he has spoken foolishly, but words which now had come true. "I have walked on roses all my life, but my hell is before me. My roses shall turn into red-hot ploughshares, and my soul shall be on fire." And he remembered how he had spoken of the unforgivable sin, high treason against friendship. But in one respect his words had not come true. He had said that in his evil hour he would have a great strong friend to stand by his side. He was walking over the ploughshares alone. And that evening, in their wait on the stairs during the first act, in retort to some jesting reply, Leonora Gurney said, "I believe you're the chilliest-natured and most heartless thing that ever walked the earth. And how you can play that love scene in the third act will always be a mystery to me." "Perhaps that's the very reason I can play it," said Herold. His heart wrung in a vice. John wrote the letter to Stellamaris. He was killing the thing he loved. Good men, and even some bad ones who have done it, do not like to dwell upon the memory. He posted the letter on his way home from the office. It dropped into the letter-box with a dull thud of the first clod of earth thrown upon a coffin. At dinner, Miss Linden talked in her usual discursive way on the warm weather and sunspots, and the curious phenomenon observable on the countenance of a pious curate friend of her youth, who had spots, not sunspots, but birthmarks, on brow, chin, and cheeks, may be a perfect sign of the cross. But the dear fellow, unfortunately, was afflicted with a red tip to his nose, wherefore a profane uncle, your great-uncle Randolph, dear, used to call him the Five of Diamonds. But he was a great gambler, your uncle, I mean. I remember him once losing 30 shillings at whist at a sitting. To all of which irrelevant chatter John made replies equally irrelevant, and Unity dumbly watched him. She had been at great pains to prepare a savoury dish that he loved. He, ordinarily of gargantuan appetite, as befitted the great-framed man that he was, scarcely touched it. Unity was distressed. "Isn't it all right, guardian?" she asked. "Yes, dear, delicious." He did not eat, and Unity knew that his heart was not in his food, it was elsewhere. He was unhappy. He had been unhappy for some time. 2 lines had come between the corners of his lips and his chin, and there was a queer pained look in his eyes. A far lesser-hearted and weaker-brained thing in petticoats than Unity would have known that John loved the radiant princess of Wonderland. Unity dreamed of it, the love between her king and her princess. Of herself she scarcely thought. Her humility, not without its pride and beauty, placed her far beneath them both. Her king was suffering. The feminine in her put aside such reasons as would have occurred to the unintuitive male: business cares, disappointed ambition, internal pain, or discomfort. He was suffering. He went about with a mountain of care on his brow that made her heart ache. He answered remarks at random. He had no appetite for the dish she adored, lamb chops en casserole, which he had learned to make from a recipe in the Daily Mirror. He was pining away for love of Stellamaris. So deeply engaged was Unity with these thoughts that it was not until she had switched on the light in her bedroom and was preparing to undress that she remembered, with a pang of dismay, that the Olympian tobacco box, old pewter, a present years ago from Herold, one of her own peculiar and precious cares, was empty. She went downstairs to the store cupboard where she hoarded the tobacco, and with it in her hand she proceeded to the study and opened the door softly. Her guardian, her king of men, her beginning and end of existence, sat in his writing-chair, his head bowed on his arms, folded on the table. A blank sheet of paper lay on the blotter. She saw that his great shoulders shook. As he did not hear her enter, she stole on tiptoe to the table and laid the packet of tobacco on the corner. She tiptoed back to the door, and turned and stayed there for a moment, watching him, soul-racked with futile longing to bring him comfort. She caught muffled words. She knew in her heart that nothing she could do would be of any avail. In an instinctive gesture she stretched out her hands piteously towards the bowed head, and went out of the room, noiselessly closing the door behind her. That night she cried as she had never cried before, not even when hot irons had seared her flesh. An hour or so afterwards John Risca put out the lights in his study and went upstairs to bed. He could not sleep, and he thought, after the poor but human manner of men, not so much of the killing of the thing he loved, as of the unimaginable, intolerable blank in his own life when the thing he loved should be killed. In the morning he said to himself, "She's got my letter," and fell into a frenzy of speculation. That day he watched the post for an answer, and the next day, and the next, and the next, but no answer came. For the irony of fate had so ordained that, as with the other unanswered letters, Stellamaris, her fingertips quivering with shame and horror at contact with the envelope, had destroyed it unopened. End of Chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 20. Unity watched the beloved being as only a woman can watch man, or a sailor can watch sea and sky. To each, signs and portents of vital matters. She noted every shadow on his face, every deepening line, every trick of his eyes, every mouthful that he ate, and the very working of his throat as he swallowed. She noted the handwriting on envelopes and unfinished manuscript, the ashes knocked out of pipes, the amount of evening whisky consumed, and the morning muddle of pillow and bedclothes. She was alive to his every footstep in the house. She knew, without entering the study, whether he was working or sitting morose in his old leather armchair, or pacing the room. She knew whether he slept or was restless of nights. One day she made a discovery, and in consequence took the first opportunity of private use of the telephone, and rang up Herold. She was anxious about her guardian. Could she see Herold as soon as possible, without Aunt Gladys or guardian knowing? They arranged a meeting just inside the park, by the Marble Arch. Herold, who knew Unity to be a young woman of practical common sense, had readily assented to her proposal, and in considerable perturbation of mind started from his home in Kensington. He arrived punctually at the Marble Arch end of the park, but found her already there, a patient, undistinguished little figure in her tartan blouse and nondescript hat adorned with impossible roses. The latter article of attire was her best hat. She had bought it already trimmed for 7 and 6, which had seemed a reckless expenditure of her guardian's money. She was sitting on a bench of the broad carriage drive, watching with a London child's interest, despite her preoccupation, the gorgeous equipage, carriages, and automobiles transporting the loveliest ladies, save one, in the world, ravishingly raimented, from one strange haunt of joyousness to another. For it was 3:30 of the clock on a beautiful day in the height of the London season, and as everybody knows, Hyde Park is a royal park, and along that stretch of road from Hyde Park Corner to the Marble Arch, no cart or omnibus or hackney cab or pretentious taxi is allowed under penalty of instant annihilation. Only the splendour, in eyes such as Unity's, of plutocratically owned vehicles meets the enraptured vision. Pedestrian fashion, however, does not haunt that end of the road, which is mostly given up to nursemaids and drab members of the proletariat. But the flower-beds make compensation by blazing with colour, and the plane trees wave their greenery over everything. Herold raised his hat, shook hands, and sat down by Unity's side. "It's good of you to come, Mr. Herold. I scarcely dared ask you, but—" "What's gone wrong?" he asked, with a smile. She began her tale, how her guardian neither ate nor slept, how he tore up page after page of copy. He used to write straight ahead. She found the pieces in the waste-paper basket. How he was growing gloomy and haggard and ill. Her woman's mind laid pathetic stress on these outward and visible signs. "You must have noticed a difference in him, Mr. Herold," she said tearfully. He nodded. John took trouble badly, which was one of the reasons that endeared Herold to him. In some aspects he was nothing but a Pantagruelian infant, but it was no use discoursing on this to Unity. "He feels things very deeply," he said instead. "Wouldn't you, if you loved Miss Stella, and never saw or heard from her?" "I should," said he, with a smile. "And she loves him, I know it, and she feels deeply, too." He acquiesced. "She, too, is very unhappy." "And they're separated forever because they can't marry?" "That is so, Unity," said he. "Why can't he get rid of her? The other woman, I mean," cried Unity fiercely. "She has given him no grounds for divorce." Unity twisted her handkerchief in her hands. "I suppose there comes a time," she said, "when people can't stand any more suffering, and they break down or do something dreadful." "Your guardian is too strong for that," replied Herold. I don't know," the mothering instinct spoke. "That's what I've come to ask you about. I'm frightened." She turned on him a miserable, scared face, and told him of her discovery. She had gone into her guardian's study that morning in order to tidy up, and had seen that he had left the key in the lock of his private drawer, with the rest of the bunch hanging from it. She had opened the drawer, and found, lying on top of some documents, one of which was a sealed envelope, endorsed, "My will," a loaded revolver, and a case of cartridges. She knew that the revolver was loaded because she had examined it. Then, hearing his step, she had shut the drawer and gone on with her dusting. He had entered, locked the drawer, put the bunch in his pocket, and gone out without a word. Herold looked grave. More in order to gain time for reflection than to administer a moral lesson, he said, "You shouldn't have searched his private drawer, Unity." "I'd search anything, if only I could find a way of helping him," she replied impetuously. "When I see him suffer and can't do anything for him, I feel crazy. Can't sleep sometimes, stand outside his door in the middle of the night. It doesn't matter whether I oughtn't to have done it or not," she cried with an awkward and impatient gesture. "I did it, and I found what I found. What I want to know is, why should my guardian make his will and keep a loaded revolver in his room unless he thought that he was going to die?" Her eyes filled with tears. Herold, alarmed by her news and touched by her devotion, took her cheap gloved hand and pressed it. Occupants of the dazzling equipage stared at the elegantly attired gentleman and the dowdy little girl love-making on the public seat. He tried to reassure her. "Every man with folks depending on him makes a will, so we can dismiss that. And I know heaps of men who keep revolvers." "But why should the will be dated 2 days ago?" asked Unity. "Was it?" "The date was written on the envelope, with my will and his name." "In all probability," said Herold, "the cloud that has come between him and Stellamaris has made him decide to make a fresh will. I know he made one some years ago." "But why the revolver?" "He spoke to me also some years ago about getting one. There had been 1 or 2 burglaries and an ugly murder, don't you remember, in the neighbourhood? He must have got it then." "It looks too new," said Unity. "Those things keep new for ever so long if they're not used," he argued. "Then you think there's no danger?" she asked, with both her hands on his wrist. "Not at present," he said with a smile. "Look after him as closely as you can, and keep up your brave little heart, or we'll have you too going about with hollow eyes and gaunt cheeks, and we can't afford it." "Me?" she sniffed derisively. "I'm as tough as an horse, and what do I matter?" "Your guardian would have a pretty poor time of it if he had only Aunt Gladys to look after him." A shadow of a grin flickered over Unity's face. "I suppose he would," she said. She went away half comforted. She had shared her terrifying secret with Herold, which was a good and consoling thing, but she had not been quite convinced by his easy arguments. And Herold went away entirely unconvinced. He knew John as no one, not even Unity, who made him the passionate study of her life, could know him. It was his peculiarity to pursue his right-headed ideas with far less obstinacy than his wrong-headed ones. In the former case he had a child's, and sometimes a naughty child's, hesitations, and was amenable to argument. But when bent on a course of folly, he charged blindly, and could be stopped only with great difficulty. Herold walked through the park in anxious thought, and at a loose end for an hour or two took a taxi to the club to which both he and John belonged. Avoiding the lounge and its cheery talk, he mounted to the deserted morning-room, and having ordered tea, settled down to an evening newspaper, the pages of which he stared at, but did not read. Presently, to his surprise, John, who had avoided the club for some little time, burly and gloomy, entered the room. "I thought I'd come in for a quiet talk with somebody, but there's that ass Simmons downstairs. He makes me sick." Simmons was the wit and brilliant raconteur of the club. "You can have a quiet talk with me, if I'm good enough," said Herold. "I've been wanting to see you. What line are you going to take in the review on this latest freak of the censor?" The prohibition of a famous continental play had aroused the usual storm in the theatrical and journalistic world. Everyone who wrote turned his back on the harmless and ridiculously situated man, and in cuttlefish fashion squirted ink at him. But John Risca took no interest in the question, and stated the fact with unnecessary violence. He, on his side, had wanted to see Herold. He had taken his advice and written to Stella, and had received no reply. More than a week had passed. The whole thing was driving him mad. Herold made a proposal which had been vaguely in his head for some days, and to which Unity's communication had given definiteness. "Come away with me on a sea voyage, a couple of months, to South Africa, anywhere you like. I'm tired out. As for the piece, it's near the end of the run, and it'll hurt no one if I go out and let Brooke play my part. I haven't had a holiday for 2 years. It would be an act of charity. You can get away. No man is indispensable, and you can afford it. If you stay here, you'll lose your balance and very likely commit some act of idiotic folly. By our return, time will have done its soothing work, and the relations between Stella and yourself will have been readjusted." Such was the substance of that which for a solid hour he strove to nail into John's armour-clad mind. His efforts were vain. In the first place, John was not going to accept such a quixotic sacrifice of professional interests from any man, even from Herold. Secondly, he couldn't get away from London and didn't want to. Thirdly, if he were being driven mad within a journey of an hour or so from Stellamaris, he would become a raving maniac if he were separated from her by half the length of the earth. Fourthly, he was in perfect health and perfect command of his faculties, and the only meaning he could attack to Herold's insinuation regarding idiotic folly was that he might forget himself so far as to go down to Southcliff and make a scene with Stellamaris, thereby acting with insensate cruelty towards her, all of which was ludicrous, and it was insulting on Herold's part to make such a suggestion. Herold called him a fool, and said that he did not mean that at all. "Then what did you mean?" "When a man loses control over himself and lets himself be obsessed by a fixed idea, his brain's not right, and he's capable of anything. The only chance for him is change of scene and interests, and that's why I've been imploring you to come away with me." "And that's why I'm going to do nothing of the kind," said John, rising and looking down upon his friend with bloodshot eyes. "I'm pretty miserable, I own. Lots of men are, and they have to keep their mouths shut because they haven't anyone before whom they are not ashamed to let off steam. I've got you. I've had you all my man's life. I've told you everything. Somehow I've not been ashamed to tell you things I wouldn't dream of breathing to any other man living. There's a kind of woman, I believe, whom I might have talked to as I do to you. I've not met her, so I've got into the habit of coming to you with whatever worries me, and you've never failed me. And I've come to you now. But there are limits beyond which even a friend like you has no right to go. You've no right to tell me I'm going out of my mind, and to warn me against behaving like the inmate of a lunatic asylum. You've no right. I resent it. I'm not going to stand it. Herold's reply was checked by the creaking of the door and the entrance of the bent figure of an old member, a county court judge, who, on his way to a writing table by the window, nodded courteously to the two younger men and remarked that it was a fine day. "I suppose most people would call it so," said John. "Don't you?" "I hate it," cried John. "I wish it would rain. I wish it would rain like the devil. I would give my ears for a pea-soup fog. Sunshine is too blightedly ironical in this country." The old judge lifted his eyebrows. "The metaphysics of meteorology are beyond me," he said, with a smile and a bow, and sat down to write. John lingered for a second or two by the side of his friend, tracing the pattern of the Turkey carpet with the toe of his boot. Then he swung round abruptly. "Excuse me," said he, "I've got to look at Baxter's imbecile article in the Contemporary." He went to the table where the current magazines and reviews were tidily displayed, and Herold, sitting in an armchair some distance away, with his back to the table, pondered over the discussion that had just taken place. But for the rumble and clatter of London that came through the open windows, the ceaseless choric ode to all the drama of the vast city, there was silence in the spacious room, broken only by the scratching of the old judge's quill pen. Herold resumed his aimless skimming of the evening newspaper. What further appeal could he make to John in his contradictory and violent mood? At last, the old judge, having scribbled his note, got up and left the room. Herold turned and found himself alone. John had gone without drum or trumpet. In the lounge downstairs there was no John, and in the hall the porter told him that Mr. Risca had left the club. He went home to his actor's 6 o'clock dinner, and found a letter from Lady Blount imploring him to come to Southcliff at once. Stella was getting worse day by day. Sir Oliver and she were in despair. Dr. Ransom was at his wits' ends. In a woman's frantic helplessness, she adjured him to come and work a miracle. Now it so happened that on the early afternoon of the next day he had a very important appointment. It was a question of his going into nominal management in the autumn. Suitable pieces, the theatre, and financial backers, obscure but vital elements in theatrical business, had been found, and it was with these last that the morrow's all-important interview was to take place. He turned up the railway timetable, and saw that by leaving London by the first train in the morning, and probably skipping lunch, he could spend a couple of hours in Southcliff and get back in time for his engagement. He telegraphed to Lady Blount, dined, and went to the theatre. For perhaps the first time in his pleasant life he was overwhelmed that evening by the sense of the futility of his work, which every artist, actor, painter, and poet is doomed to feel at some times. The painted faces of his colleagues, the vain canvas of the sets, the stereotyped words, gestures, inflections, repeated without variation for more than the 200th time, the whole elaborate make-believe of life that at once is and is not the theatre. All this oppressed him, filled him with shame and disgust. It had no meaning. It was an idle show. He had given to inanity a life that might have been devoted to the pursuit of noble ideals. Folks are apt to imagine that, when the pains of the actual world get round about an artist's soul, the supreme moment has arrived for him to deliver himself in immortal utterances. This is untrue. He doesn't so deliver himself. On the contrary, he cuts up his canvas, smashes his piano, kicks his manuscript about the room. What interpretation of life, however celestially inspired, can have the all-annihilating poignancy of life itself? Your poet may write an immortal lyric by the death-bed of his mistress, but it is a proof that he did not care a brass farthing for the lady. He is expressing the grief that he might have felt if he had loved her. For the suffering artist, at grips with the great realities, art is only a trumpery matter. It is only when he is getting, or has got better, that he composes his masterpieces, working the world to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. So Herold, instinctively obeying the common law, as all poor humans in one way or another have to do, grew heartsick at the vanity of his calling, and after a mechanically perfect performance, wondered how an honest man could live such a life of shameless fraud. After a night and dawn of rain, the sun shone from a blue sky when he reached the Channel House next morning. Sir Oliver and Lady Blount received him in the dining-room. They looked very old and careworn. Like Constable, they had nothing to live for save Stellamaris, and now Stellamaris, stricken by an obscure but mortal malady, was dying before their eyes. So, antiphonally, and at first with singularly little bickering, they told Herold their story of despair. It added little to his knowledge. The symptoms of which he was already aware had intensified. That was all. But the two guardians had altered their opinion as to the cause. Sir Oliver ruefully discarded the theory of the touch of the sun, and his wife now realized that the state of Stellamaris was not merely the morbid phase through which most maidens are supposed to pass. Dr. Ransom, with intuition none too miraculous, had admitted the theory that she had something on her mind.
"But what could the poor darling innocent child have on her mind?"
cried Sir Oliver. "What indeed?" echoed Lady Blount, "unless her mind is affected."
"Oh, don't be a fool, Julia,"
said Sir Oliver. "I'm not such a fool as you think, Oliver. Stella hasn't lived a normal life, and who knows what the change of the last year may have done harm. Dr. Ransom himself said that if we could cure the mind, we could cure the body, and advised us to take her abroad so that she could be distracted by fresh scenes."
"He did nothing about insanity. You ought to be ashamed of yourself,"
said Sir Oliver with querulous asperity. Then Herold saw that the truth must be told.
"Has it never struck you that John may be the cause of it all?"
Sir Oliver jerked himself round in his chair.
"John? What do you mean?"
"Why, I wrote to John at the same time that I did to you," said Lady Blount, "begging him to come down in almost the same words. For you know, dear Walter, I'm not a clever woman, and can't say the same thing in two different ways. She doesn't know I did so, for she's so strange and won't talk to anyone alone if she can help it. I thought John and you might succeed in getting something out of her, but John hasn't replied at all. I can't understand it."
"Doesn't that bear out what I say?" asked Herold. But John, what do you mean?" Sir Oliver repeated.
"Yes, dear, what do you mean? Of course John has behaved in an extraordinary way lately. He hasn't been to see us for ever so long. But the dear fellow has explained. He's overwhelmed with work, especially at weekends. He writes me charming letters, and he corresponds regularly with Stella. I don't see—"
"Oh, for heaven's sake, Julia, let Walter put in a word,"
cried Sir Oliver, rising and throwing his cigarette end into the bank of flowering plants that filled the summer fireplace, a domestic outrage that always irritated Lady Blount, and even now caused her to wince and dart an angry glance at the perpetrator.
"Go on, tell us what you mean. Has it never occurred to you that Stella and John may have fallen in love with each other, with the ghastly barrier of the wife between them?"
The two old people looked at him, wide-eyed and drooping-mouthed. That Stellamaris, their fragile, impalpable child of mystery, more precious to them than a child of their own bodies, over whom they might have quarrelled, that Stellamaris should be a grown woman capable of a grown woman's passions, was a proposition bewilderingly preposterous. Sir Oliver found speech first.
"Stella in love with John? It's absurd. It's ludicrous. Why, bless my soul, you might just as well say that she was in love with me. It's nonsense, ridiculous nonsense."
He walked up and down beside the dining-room table with arms outstretched, shaking his thin hands in protest. Lady Blount, her elbow resting on the table, looked at Walter. "The barrier of the wife? Who could have told her?"
"John himself."
"How much?"
"I don't know."
Sir Oliver brought himself to an abrupt standstill by the side of his wife.
"He oughtn't to have done anything of the kind. Such things are not fit for her to hear."
"That's the dreadful mistake we've made all along, my dear Oliver," said Herold sadly, and he disclosed to them probabilities of which they had not dreamed. Lady Blount began to cry silently, and her husband laid his hand on her shoulder. She put up her own and clasped it. They looked very forlorn, robbed of the darling they loved. The new Stellamaris was alien to their conservatism. They did not know her. They were lost. Like children, they clasped hands, and their hearts were united at last in common dismay. Herold turned and looked out of the window. Presently he said, "She's in the garden. I'll go and talk to her, if she will let me." "Do, Walter dear. Try to make her speak. It's that awful silence that we can't bear."
"She's always been devilishly fond of you," said Sir Oliver.
Herold went out and came upon her, escorted by Constable, in a path bordered on each side by Canterbury bells and foxgloves and Sweet William. She drew herself up as he approached, and looked at him like some wraith or white lady caught in the daylight, with no gleam of welcome in her glance. The old dog, however, pushed by her to greet Herold, whom he held in vast approbation. Then, aware of being relieved from duty, he wandered down the path, where he lay down, and like a kindly elder suffered the frisky impudence of a stray kitten of the household. "I suppose they sent for you because they think I'm ill," Stella began suspiciously.
"You are ill, dearest," he replied in a quiet voice, "and it's causing us all very deep grief."
"I'm not ill," she reported, "but everyone's worrying me. I wish you would tell them to leave me alone." He took a nerveless, unresponsive hand and put it to his lips.
"Stellamaris, Stella, darling, don't you know how we all love you? How we would give everything, life itself, to make you happy?"
She withdrew her hand. "Don't talk of happiness. It's delusion."
"Every living thing can be happy after its kind," said Herold. "Look at this great bumblebee swinging in the campanula."
"You weren't sent here to talk to me about bumblebees," she said with an air of defiance.
"No, I came to speak to you about John."
It was a thrust of the scalpel. It hurt him cruelly to deal it, but it had to be dealt. He closely watched its effect. Her wan face grew even whiter, and her lips grew white, and she held herself rigid. Her eyes were hard. "I forbid you to mention his name to me."
"I must disobey you." "No, my dearest," said he, gently barring the path. "You must listen. John is as unhappy and as ill as you yourself. He is suffering greatly. I don't know what to do with him. He's going on like a madman. You must not be unjust." "I'm not unjust. I know the truth at last, and I judge accordingly." "You are hard, Stella. Perhaps that's the first unkind word anybody has ever spoken to you, and I've got to speak it, worse luck. John would have told you long ago of the unhappy things in his life if he had thought they could possibly concern you. As soon as he found out that they might do so, he told you frankly."
"He has told me nothing," said Stella icily.
"He wrote to you about his marriage over a week ago."
"I didn't read the letter. I never read his letters. I don't take them out of the envelopes. I destroy them."
Herold stared in amazement. "Then how," he cried, "do you know what you call the truth? What do you know?"
"He married a woman who is still alive. I know a great deal more," she added, ingenuous still in her cold disdain.
"More?"
His brain worked against baffling conjecture. Who could have told her? Suddenly his eyes caught the shadow of the tragedy. He made a step forward and closed his hands on her arms, and even then he felt the shock and pain of her fragility. In London, a short time ago, they were round and delicately full.
"Stellamaris, darling, tell me. It is I, Walter, who have loved you all your life, and to whom you have always told everything. Something none of us know has happened. What is it?"
She swayed back from him and half closed her eyes. "Let me go," she said faintly. "Such things are not to be spoken of. They are not to be thought of. They only come in horrible dreams one can't help." He put an arm round her instinctively to save her from falling.
"Who told you? You must speak."
She wrenched herself free and stood rigid again. "She told me. His wife herself."
"His wife?"
His head reeled. "His deserted wife, a woman with green eyes and thin lips. I suppose you know her. She came down here to tell me."
"My God!" cried Herold. "My God in heaven!"
And for the first time Stella saw a man in white shaking anger, showing his teeth and shaking his fists.
"When was it?"
She told him. He controlled the riot within him, and questioned her further, almost hectoringly, masterfully, and she replied like a woman compelled to obey, yet flinging her answers defiantly. And he went on, unrelenting, fighting not her, but the devil that had got possession of her, until she told him all, even the final horror, as far as he could wring confession from her virgin fierceness. for in the white-hot passion of his anger he had challenged her knowledge of evil almost as directly as the woman had done.
"And you believed her?" he cried. "You, Stellamaris, believe that murderous thing of infamy, when you've known John Risca and his love and his tenderness all your life? You believe it possible? John and Unity? Good God, it's monstrous, it's hellish!"
He planted himself on the path before her, hands on hips, his sensitive face set, his blue eyes aflame, and looked at her as no man or woman had ever yet looked at Stellamaris. And she met his look, and her eyes, despite the battle her proud soul was fighting, lost their hardness. A new light flashed into them, as though they had changed from agate to diamond. "She loves him, body and soul," she said. "I ought to have recognized it in London. I didn't know the meaning of things then. I do now."
"Yes, she does love him. She loves him as I love you."
And, unrealized by him, there came into his voice the vibrating notes of passion that had stirred Stellamaris to the depths at the theatre.
"With every quivering fibre, heart and spirit, body and soul."
He flung both hands before his face. These were words of madness, and went on hurriedly.
She loves him as John loves you, as the great souls of the earth can love, without thought of hope, just because they love."
She looked at him, and he looked at her, and they stood, as they had been standing all the time, in the pathway, between the gay borders of flowers. And the sky was blue overhead, and the noonday sun caressed the ivy and lichens on the Georgian front of the Channel House, which basks peacefully on the farther side of the lawn. The kitten had frisked away with feline inconsequence, and Constable sprawled stiffly asleep on the gravel, like a dead dog. "You say you love me like that?" said Stellamaris.
"You command love. Unity herself loves you like that," replied Herold loyally.
"What reason should she have for loving me? She should be jealous of me, as I was of her. And who is she? Who is Unity?" she asked with an imperious little stamp. "I've been lied to about her for many years. She too lied. Will you explain her? If she's not what that woman said, what is she?"
"I'll tell you," he said.
He spared her nothing. It was not the hour for glossing over unpleasant things. Let her judge out of the fullness of knowledge. At his tale of the torturing, he gave her the details. She shrank back, covering her eyes, and uttered a sobbing cry. It's too horrible. I can't bear it. I can't believe it." He waited a while to give her time for recovery.
"It's true," said he.
"I don't believe it," she cried, facing him again. "The woman warned me against lies that were being told about her, lies to screen Unity."
"It's true," he repeated. "If you want proofs, I could get you the newspaper reports of the trial. She was put into prison for 3 years. Then John swore that Unity should never suffer again, and by way of reparation adopted her as his own daughter. He came like a god and lifted her from misery to happiness. That's why she loves him, as you say, body and soul."
"And he loves her?"
Her tone staggered him. "He loves her as a father loves a daughter."
"And she, as a woman, loves a lover. I'm no longer a child. I know what I'm talking about." Then he saw how deep the poison had gone. It was a ghastly travesty of Stellamaris that spoke.
"You are talking wickedness, Stellamaris," he said sternly. "Go on your knees and pray to God for forgiveness."
She threw back her head. "There isn't a God, or he would not allow such foulness and horror to be on his earth. I believe in nothing. I believe nobody. I would just as soon believe that woman as you. At least she didn't pretend to be good. She rejoiced in her vileness. She hid nothing, as everyone else hides things. And now," her voice dropped to a tone of great weariness, "don't you think you've tortured me enough?" The word was a sword through his heart. He stretched out reproachful hands.
"Stella, dearest, dearest."
"Forgive me," she said. "Sometimes I hardly know what I'm saying."
"If you would only trust me."
She shook her head sadly. "I can trust no one, not even you. Let me go now." He saw that she was at the end of her strength. Any concession that she might make now would be for him a Pyrrhic victory. And it was true that he had tortured her as his whole being asserted for her soul's welfare. But he could probe her no further. They walked in silence towards the house. Constable, as soon as they had passed, rose and followed them. It is for the greater happiness of big-hearted dogs that they do not understand all things human. At the foot of the staircase leading to Stella's wing, they parted. "Stella, darling," said he, taking her hand, "if you believe nothing else, believe this. All our hearts are breaking for you." She looked at him for a long, odd moment with the diamond glitter in her eyes. "Mine is broken," she said. He stood and watched her wearily mounting the stairs until she disappeared at the turn of the landing, the old hound scrabbling up behind her. End of Chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. Herold caught his train. He had accomplished his mission. Stella had spoken. In a few words he had enlightened Stella's unhappy guardians. "Be gentle with her," he had recommended. "Don't try to force her confidence. Don't let Ransom feel her pulse too often or give her physic. Talk about the tropics, and try to stimulate her interest and make her think she would like to go on a sea voyage. Or if you can get hold of a lost baby, stick it in the garden where she can find it." He talked bravely to the old people, who would have cut off each other's heads, and their own for the matter of that, to bring back the Stellamaris of a year ago. They clung to him pathetically. If he had counselled them to shut Stella in a room and read the Minor Prophets aloud to her, they would have obeyed him with unquestioning meekness. With a smile on his lips, he had put heart into them. Lady Blount had kissed him, and Sir Oliver, watery-eyed, had wrung his hand. In the empty carriage of the train, he gave way, as your highly strung, sensitive man must do, if he would avoid disaster. He did not think. To think implies an active process. But thoughts came tumultuous, and without a struggle he let them assail him. He felt that if he attempted to put into logical order the intricacies of passionate emotion in which he and John and Stella and Unity were involved, if he attempted to gauge the effect on all their lives of this new horror brought therein by the murderous devil-woman, if he allowed himself to think of Stella's challenge, "You say you love me like that?" he would go mad. Let the burning thoughts sear his brain as they listed. His sanity demanded passive surrender. At Victoria Station he collected his wits so as to deal with the commonplace routine of life. He looked at the clock, rapidly calculating. He would have time to go home, bolt some food and drink, and go off to keep his appointment with the men of money. He drove to his house in Kensington in a taxicab, and, telling the driver to wait, let himself in with his latchkey. His man met him in the hall. "A lady waiting to see you, sir." "I have no time to see ladies. Tell her I'm very sorry and bring me a sandwich and a whisky and soda." He thought she was some persistent actress in search of an engagement. Such phenomena are not infrequent in the overcrowded theatrical world. "It's Miss Blake, sir, Mr. Risca's ward. She telephoned this morning and asked when you would be likely to be in." "Miss Blake?" He stood amazed. What was Unity doing in his house? It was only yesterday that he had seen her. What had happened? "Where is she?" "In the library, sir." He ran up the stairs. As he entered the room, Unity rose from the straight-backed chair in which she had been sitting and rushed to meet him. She was an eager and anxious Unity, still wearing the tartan blouse, but not the gorgeous hat of yesterday. A purple tam o' shanter hastily secured by a glass-headed pin had taken the place of that extravagant creation. "Oh, Mr. Herold, do you know anything about Guardian?" The eagerness faded from her face as she saw the perplexity on his. "What do you mean, dear?" "He went out last night about 7 o'clock and hasn't come back since." She wrung her hands. I thought you might be able to tell me something." He could only look at her in blank dismay and question her as to John's latest known movements. There was very little to tell. "He had an appointment in town after luncheon, which was the last time I saw him. I heard him come in about 7:15 and go straight into his study." "He left me about 5:30 at the club," said Herold. "He was all nerves and crazy-headedness. He almost quarrelled with me. He said he hadn't slept for weeks." "He hasn't," said Unity. "That's what makes me so frightened." "Well, go on." "I heard him come in. I was in the kitchen helping Phoebe. A few minutes afterwards I heard him walk down the passage, you know his quick, heavy tread, and go out again, slamming the street door. We waited dinner for ever so long, and he didn't come. Then it was bedtime. Aunt Gladys wasn't anxious, because nothing that guardian did now would surprise her. She's like that, you know, and I didn't think very much about it at first, because he's always irregular. But when it came to 2 and 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, I could never go to sleep till I hear him come in, you know, she explained simply. Then I was terribly anxious.
Why didn't you ring me up during the night? Herold asked.
I thought of it, but I didn't like to disturb you. I did early this morning, but your servant said you had already gone down to Southcliff. Oh, I was so hoping, she sighed, that he'd gone to Southcliff too. There was a letter waiting for him.
Good Lord, cried Herold with a flash of memory. So there was, from Lady Blount.
Do you know what was in it? She asked quickly.
Lady Blount told me. She said that Stellamaris was very ill, going to die, an alarming letter, and begged him to go down at once.
And he went out, but he didn't go down, said Unity. Their eyes met, and the same fear froze them.
Did you look?
No, how could I? The drawer was locked.
It must be broken open, said Herold.
The manservant came in to ask whether he should pay and dismiss the waiting driver of the taxi.
Yes, said Herold after a moment's reflection. And, Ripley, you might telephone to Mr. Bowers of Temple Chambers and say that I'm detained, that I don't know whether I'll be able to come at all.
It was impossible to transact business beneath this lowering cloud of tragedy. The men of money could wait till John was found, dead or alive. Suddenly he remembered that a taxicab was the one thing necessary. He recalled Ripley.
Let the cab wait.
He turned to Unity as soon as the man had closed the door.
It must be broken open and at once. I'll come with you and do it. I'll take the responsibility.
Yes, said Unity. Let us know the worst.
I'll go and fetch a couple of bunches of keys. We may find one to fit.
He went out and soon afterward returned, the keys jingling in his pocket. Ripley was at the hall telephone as they passed.
I'm going up to Mr. Risca's, said Herold.
In a few moments they were speeding across London. Unity sat very tense, her red hands clenched together till the knuckles showed white.
The house first, and then Scotland Yard, he said.
We must know first, she assented. He glanced at her admiringly.
You're one of the bravest girls I've ever met.
She shrugged her shoulders. It isn't a time for playing the fool and going into hysterics, she said bluntly. Many girls of her mongrel origin would have broken down under the strain, shed wild tears, uttered incoherences of terror. Not so Unity.
She is the kind that walks through fire, thought Herold.
They spoke little. He grew sick with anxiety. Lady Blount's letter had been the determining cause of John's flight from home. Of this there could be no question. It had not been a sane man who raved at him yesterday. He was primed for any act of madness. The letter was the spark. Stella ill, fading away to a ghost and as silent as one, victim to an obscure and wasting disease that baffled them all. Stella dying before their eyes. The unhappy picture of the beloved was poignant in its artlessness. It would have stirred to grief any friend of Stellamaris. What emotions, then, had it not aroused in the breast of the man who loved her desperately, and whose very love had brought her to this pitch of suffering, to this imminence of dissolution? And the appeal for help, for the immediate presence of the rock and tower of strength of the household, with what ironic force had that battered at the disordered brain? There were only 3 courses for a man situated like Risca, and gifted or afflicted with Risca's headstrong and gloomy temperament, to pursue: to surrender to the appeal, which he had not done, to find his friend and bid him stand by him while he cursed the day he was born, and the God who made him, and the devil-ruled welter of infamy which called itself a world, which, likewise, he had not done, or, in a paroxysm of despair and remorse, to fling himself beyond reach of human touch, and seek a refuge for himself in the darkness. The conclusion that he had taken this last course forced itself with diabolical logic on Herold's mind. The very key to the door of darkness had lain ready in his hand, hidden in the study drawer. Before the eyes of the imaginative man, strung tight almost to breaking point by the morning's emotions, flashed vivid pictures of tragic happenings, so vivid that they could not but be true. The reading of the letter, John standing by the study table, the letter dropping from his hands, which in familiar gesture went to the crisp, grisly hair. The bloodshot eyes, he had noted them yesterday. The heavy jaw momentarily hanging loose, then snapping tight with the grating of the teeth. The unlocking of the door, the snatching up of the evil, glittering thing, the exit along the passage with his quick, heavy tread. Did he remember to lock the drawer again? The vision was elusive. The question became insistent.
Did you try the drawer?
he asked suddenly. No, said Unity. It was unlocked. He felt sure that it was unlocked. He recalled the moving picture, bade it stay while he concentrated his soul on the drawer. And one instant it was shut, and another it did not seem flush with the framing table, and a crack 1/16 of an inch was visible. He strove to carry on the vision beyond the house door, but in vain. He saw John Risca going out grim into the soft and clouded summer evening, and then the figure disappeared into lucent but impenetrable space. Unity gripped his hand. Her common little face was like marble. "Supposing he's dead?"
"I won't suppose such a thing," said Herold.
"You must. Why not face things?"
"All right, let us face them."
"Supposing he's dead, do you think he's wicked?"
"Certainly not. Do you?"
"You know I don't," said Unity.
"Of course I know," said Herold.
"I could die for her myself, and I'm not a man," said Unity.
"Isn't it best, however, to live for those one loves, even at the cost of suffering?"
"Not if you can do them good by dying."
"Supposing he's dead," asked Herold. Clean, direct souls can ask each other such questions. "What would you do?"
Her grip grew fierce as she turned up to him her snub-nosed little Cockney face. "There'd be no need for me to kill myself. I'll die all right. Don't make any mistake about that."
"But supposing he is alive, and supposing the barrier were removed, I mean, supposing the woman, you know whom, were no longer there, and he married, what would you do?"
"What would you?"
"I?"
"You don't think you can fool me," said Unity. "You love Miss Stella as much as he does."
"How do you know?"
Unity flung her hand to the outer air. "How do I know that's an omnibus?"
"You're right, my dear. I do love her. You're one of the few human beings in this world who know what love means, and I've told you what I've told to no one living. But if she married John tomorrow, I would strangle everything wrong in me and devote my life to watching over their happiness."
"Don't you think I'd do the same?"
"I know you would."
"Then what's the good of asking me what I'd do?" said Unity.
"Talk like this helps."
Unity sought his hand again. "It does," she said gently. There was silence for a while. The white wall-enclosed houses of Maida Vale, gay in the sunshine, flashed by them. She gripped his hand harder. "But supposing he's dead? Supposing he's dead?"
"Let us suppose nothing, my dear," said Herold.
The cab stopped at Fairmont, Ossington Road. Herold gave Unity his hand to alight, and together they went through the tiny front garden, now bright with geraniums and petunias and pansies, into the house. Miss Linden, who had been watching all day for John by the drawing-room window, greeted them in the passage, her eyes red and her cap askew on her white hair. "Oh, Mr. Herold, have you found him? Where is he? I'm sure he's been run over by a motor omnibus," she continued, on learning that Herold brought no news. "The way they whiz upon you when you're not looking is so bewildering. The old days of horses were bad enough, although I do remember his poor father being upset out of a rowing boat at Ramsgate."
"You may be quite sure, dear Miss Linden," said Herold gently, "that John hasn't met with a street accident. The police would have told us long ago."
"But what could have happened to him? I know I've thought of everything."
"Very likely he went down to spend the night in the East End, so as to write a descriptive article for the Review," said Herold. "You haven't thought of that?"
Miss Linden admitted she had not, but tearfully held to the motor omnibus theory. He tried to reassure her. Unity clenched her teeth, half mad with anxiety to get to the fateful drawer. At last Herold led the dear but delaying lady into the drawing-room.
"I'm going to examine John's papers. Very likely I shall find something to put me on the track. You don't mind if I go in alone, with Unity, to tell me where things are?"
"I'm sure if you really try you'll find him. You're so clever," she replied. He kissed her hand and left her sitting by the window, the tears running down her cheeks. In the passage, Unity caught him by the hand. "Come along." They ran down the passage into the study and locked the door.
"Which is the drawer?"
"The writing table, the one to the right." Herold flew to it and tried it. His vision had been false. It was locked. He sat down in John's worn leather writing chair and pulled out his bunches of keys. One after another he tried them. Some were too large, others too small. Now and then one fitted into the keyhole and turned slightly in the wards. "It's coming."
"Yes. No."
"Let me try. It won't do." The perspiration streamed upon their faces, and their fingers shook. Sometimes the tried keys slid back into the bunch, and all had to be tried over again. A piano organ, which had been playing maddeningly in front of the house, ceased suddenly, and there was the silence of death in the room, broken only by the rattle of the keys and the tense breathing of the two. At last they assured themselves that none of the keys would fit. They tried to wrench the drawer open by the handles, but the workmanship was stout. It was clattering discord. They searched the room for some instrument to pick or break open the lock. They rummaged among unlocked drawers filled with papers, old letters, bits of sealing wax, forgotten pipes thrown together haphazard after the fashion of an untidy man. They found many rusty keys, which they tried in vain. "We must break it open," said Herold. He sent Unity for a screwdriver, and drawing her short absence, looked through the papers in the baskets on the table. But they gave no clue. Unity returned and locked the door again behind her. Once more they wrenched and jerked the drawer, and this time it gave sufficiently for the edge of the screwdriver to be inserted. And at last the woodwork broke away from the lock, and the drawer flew open, and there lay the bright revolver on the sealed envelope, just as Unity had described. Herold sank into the writing chair, and Unity steadied herself, her hands behind her, against the table. They regarded each other for a while, pale, panting, breathless. "Thank God," he whispered. "Yes, thank God." So they remained, recovering from their almost intolerable relief. John Risca had not killed himself. It was a conclusion logical enough. The probability was that he was alive. But where? What had become of him? With what frenzied intention had he fled from the house? Presently Unity drew up her squat little figure and closed the mutilated drawer. "Can she have anything to do with it?" she asked, looking at him steadily. "She?" "Yes." There was no need of explanation. She was the incarnation in women of all evil. He rose from the chair, putting his hand to his forehead. He had not thought of her in connection with John's disappearance. Judged in the light of the morning's revelation, the connection was more than possible. Of no ingenuity of fiendishness was the woman incapable. "What made you think of her?" "How can I help thinking of her?" said Unity. "It is the she-devil," he cried excitedly. "She has been at work already. My God, I have it!" He smote his palm with the fist of the other hand. "She has told him." "What?" "She went down to Southcliff and saw Stellamaris. She poisoned her ears with hideous things. She was going to throw her over the cliff." Unity, a queer light behind her patient eyes, crept up close to him, and an ugly look accentuated the coarseness of her features. "She dared? She dared to speak to my precious one? What did she say? Tell me." "She told her she was John's deserted wife, and that you—" He hesitated for a moment, and saw that he was not dealing with a young girl, but with a tragic woman. "And that you were his mistress." Unity closed her eyes for a moment and swallowed the horror. Then she looked at him again. "And what else?" "She gave to her innocent soul to understand what a mistress was. She taunted her and jeered at her. She had her at her mercy." "When did you learn this?" "This morning, from Stellamaris herself. I told her the whole truth from beginning to end, but, God help her, her soul is so poisoned that she doesn't know whether to believe the woman or me." If he knew that, said Unity slowly, he would murder her." "Would to God she were murdered!" cried Herold in a shrill voice. "Would to God she were dead! She should be killed outright like a wild beast. But not by him, oh, not by him. It would be whirling catastrophe and chaos." He walked wildly and uttered senseless things. Then he halted. But why should he know? Why should she tell him? Why should she invite her own destruction? No, she can't have told him. He took her by her shoulders. "Unity, he must never know. He would kill her. It's a hanging matter. It's unthinkable. Swear you will never tell him." "I'll never tell him," said Unity. "He must be saved," continued Herold on the same note, his sensitive face pinched and his eyes eager. "And she must be saved. All this is killing them both of those who matter all the world to you and me. This thing of infamy is standing between them and blasting their lives. She will live, and they will be destroyed." "If she were dead, would they come together?" asked Unity. "Why not? What's to prevent them? Time and love would clear up clouds.
But she, the unutterable, she will live. She will work in the dark as she did that night when she stabbed you.
I'm not thinking of that, said Unity.
But I am.
He waved her disclaimer aside, not appreciating for the moment how immeasurably was she lifted above the plane of personal desire for vengeance.
I am, he repeated. She's walking murder. She meant to murder you. She meant to murder Stellamaris. Think of it!
He threw out his arms in a wide gesture.
There's a path down there, round the face of the cliff.
I know it, said Unity. There's a bench. I used to sit there.
She lured her there. You know, it's sheer above and sheer below and rocks beneath. She played with her, cat and mouse, would have thrown her over, dashed her down, Unity, dashed that precious, beautiful body down onto the rocks. But she didn't. God sent somebody to save her life that time. But she failed. She will try again. She will work her devilishness against her, against him, against you.
I tell you, I don't care what she does to me, she interrupted roughly. What the hell does it matter what she does to me? It was the aboriginal gutter, transcendentalized, that spoke. Leave me and her out of it. I've nothing against her. I'm not a silly fool. If it hadn't been for her, I shouldn't be here living like a lady. I ain't a lady, but I'm supposed to be one. And I shouldn't have known him, and I shouldn't have loved him. And I shouldn't have known my precious one, and I shouldn't have known you. I should have scrubbed floors and washed up plates in a lodging-house, all I was fit for. I've nothing against her, nothing. She can do what she likes with me. But with him and her... She broke off on the up note.
Yes, you and I don't matter. We can put our foot on the neck of our own little devils, can't we?
Somehow he found his hands round Unity's cheeks, and his eyes looking into hers. She suffered the nervous clasp gladly, knowing in her pure girl's heart that he was a good man, that he loved Stellamaris as she loved John, and that he loved John as she loved Stellamaris. Brother and sister in a spiritual relation singularly perfect in this imperfect world, they stood, the gentleman of birth and breeding, the artist, the finely fibred man of wide culture, and Unity Blake, whose mother had died of drink in a slum in Notting Hill Gate a year after her father had died in prison, and of whom Miss Linden despaired of ever making a lady. There came a twisting of the door-handle. They fell apart. Then came a tapping at the door. Herold had turned the key and opened. It was Phoebe, elderly and gaunt. She clasped her hands tight in front of her. "Oh, sir, she said.
What's the matter?
Master, he's found. Your servant has just telephoned. Mr. Risca has met with an accident. Is at your house, and would you please go there at once?" End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. They found him lying on the sofa, a pitiable object, the whole of his head from the back of his neck to his eyebrows swathed in bandages. His clothes were mere limp and discoloured wrappings. They looked as though they had been wet through, for the red of his tie had run into the shirt front and collar. The coarse black sprouts on pallid cheek and upper lip gave him an appearance of indescribable grime. His eyes were sunken and feverish. Unity uttered a little cry as she saw him, but checked it quickly, and threw herself on her knees by his side. "Thank God you're alive!" He put his hand on her head. "I'm all right," he said faintly. "You shouldn't have come. That's why I didn't go straight home. I didn't want to frighten you. I'm a ghastly sight, and I should have scared your aunt out of her wits."
"But how in heaven's name, man," said Herold, "did you get into this state?"
"Something hit me over the head, and I spent the night in rain and sea-water on the rocks."
"On the rocks? Where? At Southcliff?"
"Yes," said John, "at Southcliff. I was a fool to go down, but I've been a fool all my life, so a bit more folly doesn't matter." He closed his eyes. "Give me a drink, Wally, some brandy." Herold went into the dining-room, which adjoined the library, and returned with decanter, siphon, and glasses. He poured out a brandy and soda for John, and watched him drink it. Then he realized he too would be the better for stimulant. With an abstemious man's idea of taking brandy as medicine, he poured out for himself an extravagant dose, mixed a little soda-water with it, and gulped it down. "That'll do me good," said John, but on saying it he fell to shivering, despite the heat of the summer afternoon. "You've caught a chill," cried Unity. She counselled home and bed at once. "Not yet," he murmured. "It was all I could do to get here. Let me rest for a couple of hours. I shall be all right. I'm not going to bed," he declared with sudden irritability. "I've never gone to bed in the daytime in my life. I've never been ill. I'm not going to be ill now. I'm only stiff and tired." "You'll go to bed here right away," said Herold. John protested. Herold insisted. "Those infernal clothes, you must get them off at once," said he. John, being physically weak, his natural obstinacy gave way. Unity saw the sense of the suggestion, but it was giving trouble. "Not a bit," said Herold. "There's a spare bedroom. John can have mine, which is aired. Mrs. Ripley will see to it." He went out to give the necessary orders. Unity busied herself with unlacing and taking off the stiffened boots. Herold returned, beckoned to Unity, and whispered that he had telephoned for a doctor. Then he said to John, "How are you feeling, dear old man?" "My head's queer, devilish queer. Something fell on it last night and knocked me out of time. It was raining, and I was sheltering under the cliff on the beach, the other side of the path, when down came the thing. I must have recovered just before dawn, for I remember staggering about in a dazed way. I must have taken the road round the cliff, thinking it the upper road, and missed my footing and fallen down. I came to about 9 this morning on the rocks, the tide washing over my legs. I'm black and blue all over. Wonder I didn't break my neck. But I'm tough." "Thank God you're alive," said Unity again. He passed his hands over his eyes. "Yes, you must have thought all manner of things, dear. I didn't realize till Ripley told me that I hadn't let you know. I went out meaning to catch the 7:15 and come back by the last train. But this thing knocked all memory out of me. I'm sorry." Herold looked in bewilderment at the stricken giant. Even now he had not accounted for the lunatic and almost tragic adventure. What was he doing on the beach in the rain? What were the happenings subsequent to his recovering consciousness at 9 o'clock? "Does it worry you to talk?" he asked. "No. It did at first, I mean this morning, but I'm all right now, nearly all right. I'd like to tell you, I picked myself up all over blood, a devil of a mess, and crawled to the doctor's. Not Ransom, the other chap, Theed. He's the nearest, and besides I didn't want to go to Ransom. I don't think anyone saw me. Theed took me in and fixed me up and dried my clothes. Of course he wanted to drag me to the Channel House, but I wouldn't let him. I made him swear not to tell them. I don't want them to know. Neither of you must say anything. He also tried to fit me out, but you know he's about 5'0". It was absurd. As soon as I could manage it, he stuck me in a train, much against his will, and I came on here. That's all." "If only I'd known," said Herold. "I was down there all the morning." "You?" "I had a letter from Julia summoning me." "So had I." He closed his eyes again for a moment. Then he asked, "How is Stella?" "I had a long talk with her. I may have straightened things out a bit. She'll come round. There's no cause for worry for the present. Julia is a good soul, but she has no sense of proportion, and where Stella is concerned, she exaggerates." When a man has had rocks fall on his head, and again has fallen on his head upon rocks, it is best to soothe what is left of his mind. And after Walter had partly soothed it, a very difficult matter first, because it was in a troubled and despairing state, and secondly, because John, never having taken Unity into his confidence, references had to be veiled, he satisfied the need of another brandy and soda. Then Ripley came in to announce that the room was ready. "Ripley and I will see to him," said Herold to Unity. "You better go and fetch him a change of clothes and things he may want." "May I wait till the doctor comes?" she pleaded. "Of course, my dear. There's no hurry," said Herold. The two men helped Risca to his feet, and taking him to the bedroom, undressed him, clothed him in warm pyjamas, and put him into the bed, where a hot water bottle diffused grateful heat. Herold had seen the livid bruises on his great muscular limbs. "Anyone but you," said he, with forced cheeriness, "would have been smashed to bits like an egg." "I tell you I'm tough," John growled. "Then it'd please you that I submit to this silly foolery of going to bed." As soon as Ripley was dismissed, he called Herold to his side. "I'd like to tell you everything, Wally. I couldn't in the other room. Unity, poor child, knows nothing at all about things. Naturally, I've been worried all the afternoon. I thought I saw her, hanging about outside the office. It was just before I met you at the club. I didn't tell you. Perhaps I ought to. But that was why I was so upset. But you'll forgive me. You've always forgiven me. Anyway, I thought I saw her. It was just a flash, for she, if it was she, was swallowed up in the traffic of Fleet Street. After leaving the club, I went back to the office. Verification in proofs of something in Baxter's article. I found odds and ends to do. Then I went home, and Julia's letter lay on my table. I've been off my head of late, Wally. For a matter of that, I'm still off it. I've hardly slept for weeks. I found Julia's letter. I looked at my watch. There was just time to catch the 7:15. I ran out, jumped into a taxi, and caught it just as it was starting. But as I passed by a third-class carriage, in fact I realized it only after I'd gone several yards beyond, on rushes, I seemed to see her face, those thin lips and cold eyes framed in the window. The guard pitched me into a carriage. I looked out for her at all the stations. At Tring Bay, the usual crowd got out. I didn't see her. No one like her got out at Southcliffe. What's the matter, Wally? He broke off suddenly. Nothing, man, nothing, said Herold, turning away and fumbling for his cigarette case. You looked as if you'd seen a ghost. It was I who saw the ghost. He laughed, and the laugh, coming from the haggard face below the brow-reaching white bandage, was horrible. Your brain was playing you tricks, said Herold. You got to Southcliffe. What happened? I felt a fool, said John. Can't you see what a fool a man feels when he knows he's played the fool? Bit by bit he revealed himself. At the gate of the Channel House he reflected. He had not the courage to enter. Stella would be up and about. He resolved to wait until she went to bed. He wandered down to the beach. The rain began to fall, fine, almost imperceptible. The beacon light in the west window threw a vanishing shaft into the darkness. We saw it once, don't you remember, years ago when you gave her the name, Stellamaris? I sat like a fool and watched the window. How long, I don't know. My God, Wally, you don't know what it is to be shaken and racked by the want of a woman. By love for a woman, you mean, said Herold. It's the same thing. Last I saw her, she stood defiant in the light. She'd changed. I cried out towards her like an idiot. The rugged, grim half-face visible beneath the bandage was grotesque, a parody of passion. And I stayed there, watching, after she had gone away. How long, I don't know. It was impossible to ring at the door and see Oliver and Julia. He laughed again. You must have some sense of humour, my dear man. Fancy Oliver and Julia. What could I have said to them? What could they have said to me? I sat staring up at her window. The rain was falling. Everything was still. It was night. You know how quiet everything is there. Then I seemed to hear footsteps, and I turned, and a kind of shape, a woman's, disappeared. I know I was off my head, but I began to think. I had a funny experience once. I've never told you. It was the day she came out of prison. I sat down in St. James's Park and fell half asleep, that sort of dog sleep one has when one's tired. And I thought I saw her going for Stella in her bed at the Channel House, going to strangle her. This came into my mind, and then something hit me. A chunk of overhanging cliff loosened by the rain, I suppose. And as I've told you, it knocked me out. But it's devilish odd that she should be mixed up in it. As I said, your brain was playing you tricks, said Herold, outwardly calm. But within himself he shuddered. The woman was like a foul spirit hovering unseen about those he loved. Presently the doctor, a young man with a cheery face, came in and made his examination. There was no serious damage done. The only thing to fear was the chill. If the patient's temperature went down in the morning, he could quite safely be moved to his own home. For the present, rest was imperative, immediate sleep desirable. He wrote a prescription, and with pleasant words went away. Then Unity, summoned to the room, heard the doctor's comforting opinion. "I'll be with you tomorrow," said John. "You don't mind leaving him to Mrs. Ripley and me just for one night?" asked Herold. "He's always safe with you," Unity replied, her eyes fixed not on him, but on John Risca. "Goodbye, guardian dear." John drew an arm from beneath the bedclothes and put it round her thin shoulders. Goodbye, dear. Forgive me for giving you such a fright, and make my peace with Auntie. You'll be coming back with my things, won't you? Of course, but you'll be asleep then. I shouldn't wonder, said John. She made him cover up his arm again and tuck the bedclothes snugly about him, her fingertips lingering by his cheeks. I'll leave you too. Try and get to sleep, said Herold. They went together out of the room and back to the library. Has he said anything more? He stood before her, trembling all over. What's the matter? He burst into an uncontrollable cry. It's that hellish woman again. He saw her spying on him outside his office. He saw her in a railway carriage on the train he took. Because she disappeared each time, he thinks it was an hallucination, and somehow he was aware of her presence just before the piece of rock came down. Unity's face beneath the skimpy hair and rubbishy Tanime Shanto was white and strained. She threw it. I knew she threw it. So do I. He saw her. She disappeared as she did that night in the fog. A woman like that isn't human. She has the power of disappearing at will. You can't measure her cunning. What did he go down for? He told her. Unity's lips twitched. And he sat there in the rain just looking at her window. She put out her hand. Goodbye, Mr. Herold. When you see Miss Stellamaris, you tell her I'm a good girl. In that way, you know, that I love her. She's been a kind of beautiful angel to me. Has always been with me. It's funny, I can't explain. But you understand. If you'd only let her see that, I'd be so happy. And perhaps she'd be happier. I'll do my utmost, said Herold. He accompanied her downstairs, and when she had gone, he returned to the library and walked about. The horror of the woman was upon him. He drank another brandy and soda. After a while, Ripley came in with a soiled card on a tray. He looked at it stupidly. Mr. Edwin Travers, and nodded. Shall I show the gentleman up? He nodded again, thinking of the woman. When the visitor came in, he vaguely recognized him as a broken-down actor, a colleague of earlier days. As in a dream, he bade the man sit down and gave him cigarettes and drink, and heard with his outer ears an interminable tale of misfortune. At the end of it, he went to his desk and wrote out a cheque, which he handed to his guest. I can't thank you, old man. I don't know how to, but as soon as I can get an engagement— Hello, old man, he cried, glancing at the cheque. You've made a funny mistake. The name. Herold took the slip of paper and saw that he had made the sum payable not to Edwin Travers, but to Louisa Risca. It was a shock, causing him to brace his faculties. He wrote out another cheque, and the man departed. He went softly into John's room, and found him sleeping peacefully. Soon afterward, Ripley announced that dinner was ready. It was past 6 o'clock. Great heavens, he cried aloud. I've got to play tonight. After a hurried wash, he went into the dining room and sat down at the table, but the sight and smell of food revolted him. He swallowed a few mouthfuls of soup. The rest of the dinner he could not touch. The horror of the woman had seized him again. He drank some wine, pushed back his chair, and threw down his table napkin. I don't want anything else. I'm going for a walk. I'll see you later at the theatre. The old-fashioned Kensington street, with its double line of Queen Anne houses slumbering in the afternoon sunshine, was a mellow blur before his eyes. Whither he was going he knew. What he was going to do he knew not. The rigid self-control of the day, relaxed at times but always kept within grip, had at last escaped him. Want of food and the unaccustomed drink had brought about an abnormal state of mind. He was aware of direction, aware too of the shadow shapes of men and women passing him by, of traffic in the roadway. He walked straight, alert, his gait and general demeanour unaffected, his outer senses automatically alive. He walked down the narrow, shady Church Street, and paused for a moment or two by the summer greenery of Kensington Churchyard, until there was an opportunity of crossing the High Street, now at the height of its traffic. He strode westward past the great shops, a lithe man in the full vigour of his manhood. Here and there a woman lingering in front of displays of millinery recognized the well-known actor and nudged her companion. The horror within him had grown to a consuming thing of flame. Instead of the quiet thoroughfares down which he turned, he saw picture after shuddering picture. The woman and Stellamaris, the woman and John Risca. She attacked soul as well as body. The pictures took the forms of horrible grotesques. Within his mind worked amazingly like a machine escaped from human control and running with blind relentlessness. He'd said years ago that he would pass through his hellfire. He was passing through it now. The destroyer must be kept from destroying, or be destroyed. Which of these should be accomplished through his agency? One or the other. Of one thing he was certain, with an odd, undoubting certainty, that he would find her, and finding her, that he would let loose upon her the wrath of God. She should be chained up forever, or he would strangle her. Shivering thrills diabolically delicious ran through him at the thought. Supposing he strangled her as he would a mad cat? That were better. She would be out of the world. He would be fulfilling his destiny of sacrifice. For the woman he loved, and for the man he loved, why should he not do this thing? What but a legal quibble could call it murder? Stellamaris's words rang in his ears. You say you love me like that? Yes, I love you like that. I love you like that, he cried below his breath as he walked on. He knew where she lived, the name by which she passed. John had told him many times. There were few things in John's life he did not know. He knew of the Bences, of Mrs. Oscraft, the fluffy-haired woman who lived in the flat below. Amelia Mansions, he was aware, were in the Fulham Road. But when he reached that thoroughfare, he stood dazed and irresolute, realizing that he did not know which way to turn. A passing postman gave him the necessary information. The trivial contact with the commonplace restored in a measure his mental balance. He went on. By Brompton Cemetery he felt sick and faint, and clung for a minute or two to the railings. He had eaten nothing since early morning, and then only a scrap of bacon and toast. He had drunk brandy and wine, and he had lived through the day in which the maddening stress of a lifetime had been concentrated. One or two passers-by stared at him, for he was as white as a sheet. A comfortable, elderly woman, some small shopkeeper's wife, addressed him. Was he ill? Could she do anything for him? The questioning was a lash. He drew himself up, smiled, raised his hat, thanked her courteously. It was nothing. He went on, loathing himself as men do when the flesh fails beneath the whip of the spirit. He was well now, his mind clear. He was going to the woman. He would save those he loved. If it was necessary to kill her, he would kill her. On that point his brain worked with startling clarity. If he did not kill her, she would be eventually killed by John. For John, he argued, could not remain in ignorance forever. If John killed her, he would be hanged. Much better that he, Walter Herold, whom Stellamaris did not love, should be hanged than John, much better. And what the deuce did it matter to anybody whether he were hanged or not? He laughed at the elementary logic of the proposition. The solution of all the infernally intricate problems of life is, if people only dared face it, one of childish simplicity. It was laughable. Walter Herold laughed aloud in the Fulham Road. It was so easy, so uncomplicated. He would see her, he would do what he had to do, then he would take a taxicab to the theatre. He must play tonight. Of course he would. There was no reason why he shouldn't. Only he hoped that Leonora Gurney wouldn't worry him. He would manage to avoid her during that confounded wait in the first act, when she always tried to get him to talk. He would play the part all right. He was a man, and not a stalk of wet straw. After the performance, he would give himself up. No one would be inconvenienced. He would ask the authorities to hurry on matters and give him a short shrift and a long rope. But the length of the rope didn't matter these days when they just broke your neck. There was no one dependent on him. His brothers and sisters, many years his seniors, he had not seen them since he was a child, had all gone after their father's death to an uncle in New Zealand. They were there still. The mother, who had remained with him, the Benjamin, in England, had died while he was at Cambridge. He was free from family ties. And women? He was free too. There had only been one woman in his life, the child of cloud and sea foam. Stellamaris, star of the sea, now dragged through the mire of mortal things. She should go back. She should go back to her firmament, shining down upon and worshipped by the man she loved. And he, God, he should be spared the terrifying agony of it. Thus worked the brain which Walter Herold told himself was crystal clear. It was clear enough, however, to follow the postman's directions. He took the turning indicated and found the red brick block, with the name Amelia Mansions carved in stone over the entrance door. The by-street seemed to be densely populated. He went into the entrance hall and mechanically looked at the list of names. Mrs. Rawlings's name was followed by number 7. He mounted the stairs. On the landing of number 7 there were a couple of policemen, and the flat door was open, and the length of the passage was visible. Herold was about to enter when they stopped him.
You can't go in, sir. I want Mrs. Rawlings. No one can go in.
He stood confused, bewildered. An elderly, buxom woman with a horrified face, who just then happened to come out of a room near the doorway, saw him and came forward. "You are Mr. Herold?" she asked.
"Yes, I want to see Mrs. Rawlings."
"It's all right, constable," she said in a curiously cracked voice. "Let this gentleman pass. Come in, sir. I'm Mrs. Bence." He entered the passage. She spoke words to him the import of which he did not catch. His brain was perplexed by the guard of policemen and the open flat. She led him a short distance down the passage. He stumbled over a packed kit-bag. She threw open a door. He crossed the threshold of a vulgarly furnished drawing-room, the electric lights turned on despite the daylight of the July evening. There were 4 figures in the room. Standing and scribbling in notebooks were 2 men, one in the uniform of a sergeant of police, the other in a frock-coat, obviously a medical man. On the floor were 2 women, both dead. One was John Risca's wife, and the other was Unity. And near by them lay a new, bright revolver. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23. In after-time, Herold's memory of that disastrous night and the succeeding days was that of a peculiarly lucid nightmare in which he seemed to have acted without volition or consciousness of motive. He ate, dressed, drove through the streets on unhappy missions, gave orders, directions, consoled, like an automaton, and sometimes slept exhaustedly. So it seemed to him, looking back. He spared John the first night of misery. The man with his bandaged head slept like a log, and Herold did not wake him. All that could be done he himself had done. It was better for John to gather strength in sleep to face the tragedy on the morrow. And when the morrow came, and Herold broke the news to him, the big man gave way under the shock, and became gentle, and obeyed Herold like a child. Thereafter, for many days, he sat for the hour together with his old aunt, curiously dependent on her, and she, through her deep affection for him, grew singularly silent and practical. In her unimaginative placidity lay her strength. She mourned for Unity as for her own flesh and blood, but the catastrophe did not shake her even mind, and when John laid his head in her lap and sobbed, all that was beautiful in the woman flowed through the comforting tips of her helpless fingers. From Herold he learned the unsuspected reason of Unity's crime and sacrifice, and from Unity too, for a poor little pencil scrawl found in her pocket and addressed to him told him of her love and of her intention to clear the way for his happiness. And when the inquest was over and Unity's body was brought to Kilburn and laid in its coffin in her little room, he watched by it in dumb stupor of anguish. Herold roused him now and then. Action, nominal action at least, had to be taken by him as surviving protagonist of the tragedy. The morning after the deed, the newspapers shrieked the news, giving names in full, raking up memories of the hideous case. They dug, not deep, for motive, and found long smouldering vengeance. Unity was blackened. John responded to Herold's lash. This must not be. Unity must not go to her grave in public dishonour. Truth must be told. So at the inquest, John, wild, uncouth, with great strips of sticking plaster on his head, told truth, and gave a romantic story to a hungry press. It was hateful to lay bare the inmost sacredness and the inmost suffering of his soul to the world's cold and curious gaze, but it had to be done. Unity's name was cleared. When he sat down by Herold's side, The latter grasped his hand, and it was clammy and cold, and he shook throughout his great frame. Then Herold, driven to mechanical action, as it seemed to him afterward by a compelling force, dragged John to an inquiry into the evil woman's life. It was Mrs. Oscraft, the full-blown, blousy bookmaker's wife, the woman's intimate associate for many years, who gave the necessary clue. Horrified by the discovery of the identity of her friend and by the revelation of further iniquities, she lost her head when the men sternly questioned her. She had used her intimacy with Mrs. Risca to cover from her own husband an intrigue of many years' standing. In return, Mrs. Risca had confessed to an intrigue of her own, and demanded, and readily obtained, Mrs. Oscraft's protection. The women worked together. They were inseparable in their outgoings and incomings, but abroad each went her separate way. That was why, ignorant of the truth, Mrs. Oscraft had lied loyally when John Risca had burst into her flat long ago. She had thought she was merely shielding her fellow sinner from the wrath of a jealous husband. Thus, for years, with her cunning, Mrs. Risca had thrown dust in the eyes both of her friend and of the feared and hated wardress whom John had set over her. Under the double cloak she had used her hours of liberty to carry out the set, relentless purpose of her life. To spy on him with exquisite craft had been her secret passion, to strike, when the time came, the very meaning of her criminal existence. And for the last 2 or 3 years she gave no trouble, and was as gentle as a lamb, so how could I suspect? Mrs. Bence lamented. It's all over, said John stupidly. It's all over. Nothing matters now. To Herold, in after-time, the memories of these days were as those of the doings of another man in his outer semblance. His essential self had been the crazy being who had marched through the mellow Kensington streets with fantastic dreams of murder in his head. At the sight of Unity and the woman lying ghastly on the floor, something seemed to snap in his brain, and all the cloudy essence that was he vanished, and a perfect mechanism took its place. When John, with wearisome reiteration, said, "God bless you, Wally. God knows what I should have done without you," it was hard to realize that he had done anything deserving thanks. He was inclined to regard himself, when he had a fugitive moment to regard himself, with abhorrence. He had talked, Unity had acted. And deep down in his soul, only once afterwards in his life to be confessed, dwelt an awful remorse for his responsibility in the matter of Unity's death. But in simple fact, no man in times of great convulsion knows himself. He looks back on the man who acted and wonders. The man, surviving the wreck of earthquake, if he be weak, lies prone and calls on God and man to help him. If he be strong, he devotes the intensity of his faculties to the work of rescue, of clearing up debris, of temporary reconstruction, and has no time for self-analysis. It is in reality the essential man in his vigour and courage and nobility and disdain who acts, and the bruised and shattered about him who profit by his help look rightly upon him as a god. It was only after John had visited the house of death, where, according to law, the bodies both of slayer and slain had to lie, and had seen the pinched, common face, swathed in decent linen, of the girl who for his sake had charged her soul with murder and taken her own life, and after he had driven away, stunned with grief and carrying with him, at his feet in the taxicab, the useless kit-bag packed by the poor child, with heaven knows what idea of its getting to its destination, and had staggered to the comfort of the foolish old lady's outstretched arms and received her benediction, futilely spoken, divinely unspoken. It was only then that, raising haggard eyes, all the more haggard under the brow-reaching bandage he still wore, he asked the question, "What about Stella? She's bound to learn." "I wrote to her last night," said Herold. "I prepared her for the shock as best I could." A gleam of rational thought flitted across John Risca's mind. "You remembered her at such a time, with all you had to do? You're a wonderful man, Wally. No one else would have done it." "Are you in a fit state of mind," said Herold, "to understand what has happened? I tried to tell you this morning," as he had done fitfully, "but it was no use. You grasped nothing." "Go on now," said John. "I'm listening." Sir Herold, amid the fripperies of Miss Linton's drawing-room, told the story of his summons to the Channel House some time ago. Good God, he caught himself up sharply. It was only yesterday. And of his talk with Stellamaris in the garden, and of her encounter with the evil woman, and of the poison that had crept to the roots of Stella's being. John shivered and clenched impotent fists. Stella left alone on the cliff edge with that murderous hag. Stella's ears polluted by that infamous tale. If only he had known it. Why did she hide it from him? It was well the murderess was dead, but merciful heaven, at what a price! "Listen," said Herold gravely, checking his outburst, and he told of his meetings with Unity. It was essential that John should know. Of her almost mystical worship of Stellamaris, of their discovery of the revolver. "Poor child," cried John. "I bought it soon after I went to Kilburn. I took it out the other day and played with a temptation I knew I shouldn't succumb to. I should never have had the pluck." Herold continued, telling him all he knew, all save that of which he stood self-accused, and which for the present was a matter between him and his Maker. And Miss Linden, fondling on her lap a wheezy pug, the successor to the dandy of former days who'd been gathered to his father's long ago, listened in placid bewilderment to the strange story of love and crime. "I'm sure I don't understand how people think of such things, let alone do them," she sighed. "You must accept the fact, dear Miss Linden," said Herold gently. "God's will be done," she murmured, which in the circumstances was as relevant a thing as the poor lady could have uttered. But John sat hunched up in a bamboo chair that creaked under his weight, and scarcely spoke a word. He felt very unimportant by the side of Unity, Unity with whose strong, passionate soul he had dwelt in blind ignorance. And Unity was dead, lying stark and white in the alien house. After a long silence he roused himself. "You wrote to Stella, you said?" "Yes," replied Herold. "What will happen to her?" "I don't know." John groaned. "If only I had protected her as I ought to have done. If only I had protected both of them." He relapsed again into silence, burying his face in his hands. Presently Miss Linden put the pug tenderly on the ground, rose, and stood by his chair. "My poor boy," she said, "do you love her so much?" "She's dead," said John. Herold shook him by the shoulder. "Nonsense, man. Pull yourself together." John raised a drawn face. "What did you ask? I was thinking about Unity." That day, the day after the tragedy, Stellamaris faced life in its nakedness, stripped, so it appeared to her, of every rag of mystery. She had breakfasted as usual in her room, bathed and dressed, and looked wistfully over her disowning sea. Then, as she was preparing to go downstairs, Morris had brought in Herold's letter, scribbled so nervously and shakenly that at first she was at a loss to decipher it. Gradually it became terribly clear. Unity was dead, the woman was dead. Unity had killed the woman, and then killed herself. "Details of everything but the truth will be given in the morning papers," Herold wrote. "But you must know the truth from the first, as I know it. Unity has given her life to save those she loved, you and John, from the woman. She's laid down her life for you. Never forget that, as long as you live." She sat for some moments quite still, paralysed by the new horror that had sprung from this false, flower-decked earth to shake her by the throat. The world was terrifyingly relentless. She read the awful words again. Bit by bit, feeling returned. Her flesh was constricted in a cold and finely wrought net. She grew faint, put her hands to her brow, and found it damp. She stumbled to her bed by the great west window, and threw herself down. Constable, lying on the hearthrug, staggered to his feet, and thrust his old head on her bosom, and regarded her with mournful and inquiring eyes. She caressed him mechanically. Suddenly she sprang up as a swift memory smote her. Once she lay there by the window, and the dog was there by the bed, and there by the door stood the ungainly figure of a girl of her own age. Was it possible that that ungainly child whom she had seen and talked to then, whom a few weeks ago she had kissed, could have committed this deed of blood? She rose again to her feet, pushed the old dog aside blindly, and hid her eyes from the light of day. The girl was human, utterly human at those two meetings. Of what unknown, devastating forces were human beings then composed? She took up the letter again. "Unity has given her life to save those she loved, you and John, from the woman. She's lain down her life for you. Never forget that as long as you live." Walter Herold said that. It must be true. Through all of yesterday's welter of misery, after he had left her, she had clung despairingly to him. There was no God, but there was Walter Herold. Her pride had dismissed him with a profession of disbelief, but in her heart she had believed him. Not that she had pardoned John Risca, not that she had recovered her faith in him, not that she had believed in unity. Her virginal soul tainted by the woman, and shrunk from thoughts of the pair. But despite her fierce determination to believe in neither God nor man, she had been compelled to believe in Herold. She had stood up against him and fought with him and had bitten and rent him, and he had conquered, and she had felt maddeningly angered, triumphantly glad. The whole world could be as false as hell, but in it there was one clear spirit speaking truth. She went to the southern window, rested her elbows on the sill, and pressed the fingertips of both hands against her forehead. The soft southwest wind, bringing the salt from the dancing sea, played about her hair. Unity had laid down her life to save those she loved. So had Christ done, giving his life for humanity. But Christ had not killed a human being, no matter how murderous, and had not taken his own life. No, she must not mix up things irreconcilable. She faced the room again. What did people do when they killed? What were the common practical steps that they took to gain their ends? Her mind suddenly grew vague. Herold had spoken of newspapers. She must see them. She must know everything. Life was deadly conflict, and knowledge the only weapon. For a few seconds she stood in the middle of the room, her young bosom heaving, her dark eyes wide with the diamond glints in their depths. Life was a deadly conflict. She would fight. She would conquer. Others, miserably weaker than herself, survived. Pride and race and splendid purity of soul sheathed her in cold armour. A jingle, separated from context, came into her mind, and in many ways it was a child's mind. Then spake Sir Thomas Howard, "For God, I am no coward." "For God, I am no coward," she repeated, and with her delicate head erect, she went out and down the stairs and entered the dining-room. There she found Sir Oliver and Lady Blount sitting at a neglected breakfast. The old faces strove pitifully to smile. Stella kissed them in turn, and with her hand lingering on the old man's arm, she gave him Herold's letter. "Is it in the newspapers?" she asked.
What, my dear?"
said Sir Oliver, adjusting his glasses on his nose with fumbling fingers. She looked from one to the other. Then her eyes fell on the morning papers lying on the table. They were folded so that a great headline stared hideously. "Oh, darling, don't read it. For heaven's sake, don't read it," cried Lady Blount, clutching the nearer newspaper. But Stella took up the other. "I must, dearest," she said very gently. "Walter has written to me, but he could not tell me everything." She moved to the window that overlooked the pleasant garden, and with steady eyes read the vulgar and soul-withering report, while the two old people, head to head, puzzled out Herold's scrawl. When she had finished, she laid the paper quietly at the foot of the table, and came and stood between them, revolted by the callous publication of names, almost physically sickened by the realistic picture of the scene, her head whirling. She caught hold of the back of Sir Oliver's chair. "The newspaper lies," she said, "but it doesn't know any better. Walter tells us why she did it." Sir Oliver, elbow on table, held the letter in his shaking grasp. It dropped, and his head sank on his hand.
"It's too horrible," he said in a weak voice. "I don't understand anything at all about it. I don't understand what Walter means. And all that old beastly story revived. It's damnable."
He looked quite broken, his querulous self-assertion gone. Lady Blount, too, gave way, and stretched out an imploring and pathetic arm, which, as Stella moved a step or two toward her, fell around the slim, standing figure. She laid her cheek against Stella, and cried miserably. "Oh, my darling, my precious one, if we could only spare you all this! Walter shouldn't have written. Oh, my darling, what are we to do? What are we to do?" And then Stellamaris saw once more that great High Excellency and most exquisite auntship, for all their love of her, were of the weak ones of the world. And she looked down with a new and life-giving feeling of pity upon the bowed grey heads. Once, was it yesterday, or weeks, or months, or years ago? She could not tell. But once, to her later pain and remorse, she had commanded, and they had obeyed. Now she knew that she had to comfort, protect, determine. And in a bewildering flash came the revelation that knowledge was a weapon not only to fight her own way through the evil of the world, but to defend the defenceless. "I wish Walter was here," she whispered, her hand against the withered, wet cheek. "Why Walter, dear?" "He is strong and true," said Stellamaris. "Why not John, darling?" Yes, why not John? Stella drew a sharp breath. Sir Oliver saved her an answer.
"John isn't enough to look to, poor chap. He's got everything about his ears. Stella's right. We want Walter. He's young. He's a good fellow, is Walter. I must be getting old, my dear."
He raised his face, and with a sudden forlorn hope of dignity, twirled his white moustache.
"A year ago I shouldn't have wanted Walter or anybody. It's only you, my child, that your aunt and I are thinking of. We've tried to do our duty by you, haven't we, Julia? God knows we love you. You're the only thing in the world left to us. It isn't our fault that you were drawn into this ghastliness. It isn't. God knows it isn't. Only, my dear," there was a catch in his voice, "you're not able to bear it. For us old folks who've knocked about the world, well, we're used to this sort of thing. I've had to send men to the gallows in my time. Once 20 men to be shot. The paltry fellows of the Colonial Office didn't see things as I did, but that's another matter. We're used to these things, dear. We're hardened."
"If I have got to live in the world, dear Excellency," said Stella, feeling that there were some sort of floodgates between the tumultuous flow of her being and the still waters of pity in which for the moment her consciousness acted, "it seems that I must get used to it, like everyone else." "But what shall we do, darling?" cried Lady Blount, clinging pathetically to the child of sea foam, from whom all knowledge of the perilous world had been hidden. "Anything but worry Walter to come down here." "I thought you wanted him." "I do," said Stella, with her hand on her bosom. "But that is only selfishness. He's needed more in London. I think we ought to go up and see if we can help in any way."
"Go up to London?"
echoed Sir Oliver. "Yes, if you'll take me, uncle dear." The old man looked at his wife, who looked helplessly at him. Through the open window came the late mellow notes of a thrush, and the sunshine that flooded the summer garden. "I'm going to send Walter a telegram," said Stella, moving gently away. She left the room with the newly awakened consciousness that she was absolute mistress of her destiny. Love, devotion, service, anything she might require from the two old people, were hers for the claiming. Anything in the world but guidance and help. She stood alone before the dragons of a world, no longer the vague, threatening land, but a world of fierce passions and bloody deeds. Herold's words flamed before her. Unity has given her life for those she loved. Had she, Stellamaris, a spirit so much weaker than Unity's? She advanced an eager step or two along the garden walk, clenching her delicate fists, and the fiery dragons retreated backward. She could give too, as well as Unity, her life, if need be. If that was not required, at least whatever could be demanded of her for those she loved. Again she read the letter. Underlying it was tenderest anxiety lest she should be stricken down by the ghastly knowledge. With the personal motive, the intense and omnipotent motive of her sex, unconsciously dominating her, she murmured half-articulately, "He thinks I'm a weak child. I'll show him that I am a woman. He shall see that I'm not afraid of life." So when Walter Herold went home late that night, the theatre being out of the question, he had stayed at Kilburn until John had been persuaded to go to bed, he found a telegram from Stellamaris. "Coming to London to see if I can be of any help. My dear love to John in his terrible trouble. Tell me when I had better come." The next day, when they met before the inquest, he showed the telegram to John, who, after glancing at it, thrust it back into his hand with a deprecating gesture. "No, let her stay there. What is she to do in this wilderness of horror?"
"I have already written," said Herold.
"To keep away?"
"To come."
"You know best," said John hopelessly. At any rate, the news hasn't killed her. I feared it would. I had long letters from Oliver and Julia this morning."
"What did they say?"
John put his hand to his head. "I forget," said he. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. Outside the house in Kilburn were stationed a hearse and 2 carriages, stared at by a knot of idlers. Within was felt the pervasive presence of a noiselessly moving, black-attired man of oiled tongue. Upstairs in the little room rested on its trestles the flower-covered coffin wherein all that remained of unity lay. The blinds of the gimcrack drawing-room were lowered, and the company sat waiting. John, Miss Linden, and Herold, Sir Oliver, Lady Blount, and Stellamaris. Although Stella had been in London for a day or 2, this was the first time that John had seen her since the riotous June day when he had waved farewell to the train carrying her back to Southcliff. He had gone to the front gate to meet her in his ill-fitting, outgrown frock-coat, sticking plaster still hiding the wounds on his scalp, and his heavy face white and drawn. She, in her black dress, looked a startling lily enveloped by night. Her great eyes had softened from diamond into starshine. Behind her came the old people, attendant ghosts. John folded her hand in his. "Stella, dear, how good of you to come," she said in a low voice. "It is to ask forgiveness from you and her." He bowed over her hand. She passed into the house where Miss Linden received her. "My dear," she said, holding Stella's hand, "I think our poor darling will go to her grave very happy. She was always talking of you ever since she came to live here, and if you wonder what has become of the beautiful lilies you sent, it's because I put them inside with her, knowing that that's where she would wish them to be. And now you've come yourself, and I'm sure she wouldn't ask for more." The weak mouth, set in the full, foolish face crowned with white hair, worked dolorously. Stella, with a sudden movement, threw her arm round her neck and broke into uncontrollable sobbing. Her soul, pure and beautiful beyond question, spoke to Stellamaris in simple words and in silly yet exquisite sentiment. She clung very close. Why, the unsuspecting and innocent lady never guessed, but it made her broad bosom swell with an emotion hitherto unknown, to have a girl lay her head there and sob and seem to find comfort. And as she clung, the lingering poison of the evil woman melted for ever from Stella's heart, and she knew that the place whereon she stood, where Unity and she had talked, that gimcrack, tawdry, bamboo drawing-room, was holy ground. She had come, poor child, full of her fierce and jealous maiden pride. She was only 20, and life had been revealed to her of late as a tumultuous conflict of men with devils. She had come highly wrought for battles with the Apollons that straggled across the path. She had come with high hopes of bringing help to the faint-hearted, solace to the afflicted, approving to her tiny world that she was the help-giver instead of the help-seeker. She had come on the wings of conquest, and she fluttered down like a tired bird to the surrender of herself on the bosom of the simplest, and in the eyes of men, the least important creature on God's earth. She drew gently away and dried her eyes, and while Miss Linden spoke a few words to Lady Blount, she went somewhat shyly up to John. "You should have let me know, Miss Linden, long ago," she said. "I should have done many things long ago," he replied, "but I myself have known my aunt only the last few days." She regarded him somewhat incredulously. "Yes," he said, "it's true. The last few days have taught me all kinds of things. I never knew what she was," he made a vague gesture, "until it was too late. I think, Stella dear, I have gone through life with my heart shut." "Except to me," said Stellamaris. "That's different," he said with a turn of his great shoulders. He left her abruptly and joined the group of the 3 elders by the window. She came to Herold, who had been standing with his back against the empty fireplace. "You must be very tired." He saw her brows knit in their familiar little fairy wrinkles as she anxiously scanned his face. Indeed, he was very weary, and his eyes and cheeks showed it. "There has been a lot not only to do, but to feel of late," he said. She put out a timid hand and touched his sleeve. You mustn't do and feel too much, or you'll break down."
"Why should I, if you haven't?"
he asked with a faint smile. "I think it cowardly to break down when one ought to be strong," she said.
"Are you afraid of my being a coward, Stella?"
"You? Oh, no, you? You've been strong. There's no need for you to do any more. You've got to live your own life, and not that of other people."
"The only life left to me," he said in a low voice, "is that of those dear to me."
John lumbered up gloomily. "You must persuade him to take a rest, Stella. He's been driving himself to death." He laid a heavy hand on his friend. "God knows what I would have done without him all this time. Wait," he said suddenly, with the other hand uplifted. And all was silent when to a scuffle of feet succeeded a measured tramp of steps descending the stairs. The bearers passed along the passage by the door of the drawing-room. Unity was going forth on her last journey through the familiar Kilburn streets. The little crowd on the pavement had swelled. The case and all about it had been manna to hungry July reporters, and all the world knew of Unity and judged her this way and that according to individual prejudice. But the male part of the crowd uncovered as the coffin and afterward the little group of mourners passed through. John and Miss Linden and Lady Blount went in the first carriage, Stella, Sir Oliver and Herold in the second. Sir Oliver, as is the way of Sir Olivers all the world over, spoke of funerals he had attended in years and latitudes both remote. "Poor Roddy Greenwood, best fellow that ever lived. It was in Berbice, Demerara. God bless his soul, it was in 68. He left him at 6 in the morning after a night's loo. Good game, loo. No one ever played it these days. And he'd have followed him to his grave that day before sunset. Then there was Freddie Nichol. They brought it in accidental because he was cleaning his gun. There were the rags and oil and things about him. But it was odd, devilish odd, that it should have happened the day after Kitty Green married that fellow. What's his name? Tut, he would remember it in a minute. Now, what the dickens was the name of the fellow Kitty Green married?" But as Kitty Green and her obscure and unremembered spouse were young in the days when Sir Oliver was young, and at the best and happiest were both wrinkled, uninteresting ancients, the baffling question did not stir the pulse of his hearers. "Anyhow," said Sir Oliver, summing up, "death is a devilish funny business. I've seen lots of it." "And you, who have seen so much of it, dear," said Stellamaris very seriously, "what do you think of death?" "I've told you, my child, I've told you. It's devilish funny. Odd. Here today and gone tomorrow. Devilish funny." They arrived at the cemetery. In the bare mortuary chapel Stella knelt and heard for the first time in her life the beautiful words of the service for the burial of the dead. And there in front of her, covered with poor, vain flowers, was the coffin containing the clay of one whom man with its opportunist laws against murder and self-slaughter was powerless to judge. At the appointed time they went out into the summer air, and walked in forlorn procession behind the hearse, through the startling city in whose tenements of stone and marble no mortal could dwell, in which there was no fevered strife as in the cities of men, in which all the inhabitants slept far beneath their stately domes or humble monoliths, at peace with mankind, themselves, and God. And green grass grew between the graves, and sweet flowers bloomed and seemed to say, "Why weep, since we are here?" But for the faint grinding of the hearse wheels on the gravelled path and the steps of the followers, all was still. Stellamaris clung to Herold's arm. "I can't believe they are all dead," she whispered. "The whole place seems alive. I think they are waiting for Unity. They will take her by the hand and make her one of themselves."
"And bow down before her," said Herold. "It is only the dead that know the great souls that pass from the earth."
They reached the graveside. The surpliced chaplain stood a pace or two apart. The dismal men in black deposited the coffin by the yellow, upturned earth. The group of 6 gathered close together. The July sunshine streamed down, casting a queer projection of shadow from the coffin end. "Man that is born of a woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up, and is cut down like a flower. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay." Stella heard the chaplain's voice as in a dream. The rattle of the earth on the coffin lid. "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust," roused her with a shock. Below, deep in the grave, lay Unity. Unity, who had taken a human life and had taken her own for the sake of those she loved. Unity, who in the approach to her murderous and suicidal end was all but unfathomable to her. Unity, whom she had read and thought enough to know to be condemned by the general judgment of mankind. There, in that oak coffin, lay all that remained of the common little girl, with the lilies she herself had sent on her bosom. The lilies she had not seen, pure white, with their pistils of golden hope, the dead white face she had not seen. Yet her lilies were looking into the dead face, and the dead face was near the lilies, down there, underneath the baffling oaken coffin lid. She became aware of words sharp and clear cutting the still air. "Who shall change our vile body, that it may be like unto his glorious body, according to the mighty working whereby he is able to subdue all things to himself? I heard a voice from heaven, saying unto me, Write, from henceforth blessed are the dead which die in the Lord. Even so saith the Spirit, for they rest from their labours." Stellamaris stood tense until the end. A great peace had fallen upon her. Blessed are those that die in the Lord. The simple words held a mystic significance. They reiterated themselves in her brain. Young, emotional, inexperienced, overwhelmed by the shattering collapse of the exquisite cloud-capped towers of her faith, she found in them an unquestioned truth. By that graveside, in the sacred presence of the dead, not only of the dear sister here departed, but of the inhabitants of all the gleaming stone and marble tenements around, there could be no lying. Such was the unargued conviction of her candid soul. A voice, coming not from the commonplace white-robed man, but from the blue vault of heaven, proclaimed that Unity had died in the Lord, and that she was blessed. The message was one of unutterable consolation. Unity had died in the Lord. The comforting acceptance of the message indicated the restoration of Stella's faith in God. The mind of the child-woman is a warp of innocence shot with the woof of knowledge, and the resultant fabric is a thing no man born can seize and put upon canvas, and for the matter of that, no woman, when she ceased to be a child. John stood for a while looking down into the grave, and gently dropped a wreath which he held in his hand. Then he turned gloomily away, and the others followed him, and the grave-diggers' spadefuls of earth rattled down on the coffin with a sound of dreadful finality. Stella's heart had softened towards John. Herold had told her how he had nearly come by his death on the rocks below the Channel House. It had moved her to the depths, and now she saw that he was bowed down with grief for Unity. All resentment against him had died. She recovered her faith, not perhaps in the wonder of the great high-belovedest of the path, but in the integrity of the suffering man. When they reached and had re-entered the house, she took an opportunity of being alone with him. The two elder ladies were upstairs, and Walter and Sir Oliver had gone out to smoke in the little front garden. Then she said with shy gentleness, "This must be very desolate for you, dear. Won't Miss Linden and you come down with us to Southcliff? I've fallen in love with her. I wonder whether I dare ask her. The sea air would do her good." "She would be delighted, I'm sure. But would you like me to come too?" he said, bending his heavy brows. "Of course," replied Stella. She flushed slightly and lowered her eyes. "I'm afraid I'm not a very gay companion, Stella. In fact, I don't think I ever was one, except in the days when I used to tell you fairy tales about the palace." "Oh, don't!" She could not restrain the quick little cry and gesture. "We mustn't talk about that any more. We've got the future to think of. Reconstruction, isn't that what they call it? We've got to look at things as they are and laugh sometimes." "I feel," said he, "as I could never laugh again." "Yet Unity meant to make you happy and not miserable," said Stella. "I know," said he, "and that's the devil of it." He paused for a moment, his hands thrust deep in his trousers pockets, and his heel on the fender. At last he said, "It would be the best thing in the world for the dear old lady, and God knows it will be good for me. So if you'll have us for a week or two, we'll be glad to get away from here. I'll ask Miss Linden when she comes down." and Miss Linden, coming down soon afterwards with Lady Blount, received and accepted the invitation. Sir Oliver, summoned from the garden, expressed his approval.
"My boy," said he, "we've been perfectly wretched without you. Make him put in a long time with us, Miss Linden. We three old folks will join forces."
Stella slipped out by the front door and stood by Herold, who was leaning over the gate. Of course, he too must come to the Channel House. He smiled rather wearily and shook his head.
"Not just now, dear," said he. "I have a week's business to do in London, settling my autumn arrangements. I'm going into management, you know, and then I must run away for a bit, abroad somewhere, a little mild climbing in Switzerland, perhaps."
Stella's face fell. "Going abroad?" she echoed. "For how long?"
"A month or so, if I can manage it. I want a rest rather badly."
"Of course you do, but I was hoping," she faltered, that you could find rest at Southcliffe."
"It's good of you, dear," said he, "to think of me. For heaven knows how many years I've looked upon the Channel House as a second home. You can never realize what it has meant to me. But I need a complete change, a sort of medicine I must take, no matter how nasty it may be. Besides," he added with a smile, "you will have John now."
"John is John, and you are you," said Stella. There was a little pause. Then, after a glance at his tired face, she said in a low voice, "You're right, Walter. You must go away and get strong again. I spoke very selfishly. I've not been accustomed to think much of other people."
"Stellamaris, dear," he said, "if I thought I could serve you by staying, I would stay. But there's nothing for me to do, is there? What shall I say? The veil between John and you has been cut in twain, as it were, by a flaming sword. Perhaps Unity did it, but there's no veil now. The only thing that has to be done is to bring back the sunshine into John's life. That's for you to do, not for me."
She looked at him queerly. Her face was so white, her dress so black. The only gleam about her was in her eyes. "I know that," she said, "but who is going to bring back the sunshine into your life?"
He leaned against the wooden gate and gripped the top bar tight. What did she mean? Was she a woman, or after all only the old fancied child of sea foam and cloud? "When I can eat like a pig and sleep like a dog," he said lightly, "and feel physically fit, I should be all right."
He smiled and took her black-gloved hand.
"And when I see the roses in your cheeks and hear you laugh as you used to laugh, that fascinating little laugh like a peal of low silver bells, then I'll be the Princess Stellamaris's court jester again."
She smiled wanly. "You were never court jester. You were great high favourite." She sighed. "How far off those childish days are."
"They'll return as soon as you're happy."
"Life is too full of pain for me to find happiness in superficial things," said Stella. For all his wretchedness, he could have laughed, with a man's sweet pity, at the tone of conviction in her philosophic but childish utterance.
"You must look for it and find it in the deep things," said he.
She made no reply, but stood thoughtfully by his side, and drew with her fingers little lines on the summer dust on the upper surface of the bar of the gate. "There's something silly I want to say to you, Walter," she murmured at last, "and I don't quite know how to say it. It's about the sea. I think you can understand. You always used to. Our long talks, you remember? Since all this has happened, the sea seems to have no meaning for me."
"It would all come back, dear," said Herold, "with your faith in God and the essential beauty of the world."
"But what is the essential beauty of the world?"
"My dear," he laughed, "you mustn't ask a poor man such conundrums and expect an instantaneous answer. I should say roughly it was strength and sacrifice and love." He took a cigarette from his case and lit it. "You'll find the comfort of the sea again. I think it will have quite a new meaning for you, a deeper meaning. Quite sure. You see, Stellamaris, dear," he added after a second or two, "you don't need me any longer. Your happiness, as well as John's happiness, is in your own hands. I can go away with an easy mind, and when I come back—"
"Yes, and when you come back?" Pain started through his eyes. When he came back, what would be left for him? His art, his ambitions, what were they? A child's vain toys cumbering his feet. His soul was set on the slip of pale girlhood, startlingly black and white, with her mass of soft hair beneath the plain black hat, and her great pools of eyes, no longer agates or diamonds, but aglow with remote flames, who, in poor common earthliness, stood by his side, but in maddening reality was pinnacled on inaccessible heights by the love between her and the man they both loved. He felt that the pure had an unsuspected power of torture.
"When I come back, well,"
he broke off lamely, and they looked at each other without speaking until they became aware of a human presence. They turned and saw John, his huge bulk in the frame of the doorway, watching them dully beneath his heavy brows. At the Channel House, Stella's health began to mend. The black shadows disappeared from beneath her eyes, and her lips caught the lost trick of a smile. She no longer wandered desolate about house and garden, but sought the companionship of those about her. The old folks discussed and wrangled over the change. "One would have thought," said Lady Blount, "that this terrible affair would have crushed her altogether."
"Anyone who didn't know her might have thought so," replied Sir Oliver. "But I've watched her. I sized her up long ago. It's astonishing how little you know of her, Julia. She has lots of pluck, the right stuff in her. And now John's free and he's down here. What more can she want?"
"Poor fellow. He doesn't seem to be much the happier for it."
"You don't expect him to go about grinning as if nothing had happened, do you?" said Sir Oliver. "Can't you understand that the man has had a devil of a shock? He'll get over it one of these days."
"I don't want him to grin, but I'd like him to look a little more cheerful," said Lady Blount. But cheerfulness and John Risca were strangers. Even when he and Stellamaris were alone together, looking at the moonlit sea from the terrace outside the drawing-room windows, or in the sunshine of the sweet cliff garden, the cloud did not lift from his brow. Unless they talked of unity, and it relieved his heart to do so, and Stellamaris loved to listen to the brave little chronicles of her life. Long silences marked their intercourse. To get back to the old plane was impossible. They could find no new one on which to meet. She gave him all her pity, for he was a man who had suffered greatly, and in a way it was she herself who had brought the suffering on him. Her heart ached to say or do something that would rekindle the old light in his rugged face, but an unconquerable shyness held her back. If he had thrown his great arm around her and held her tight and uttered broken words of love, pity would have flamed passionate in surrender. If he had pleaded for comfort, pity would have melted warm over his soul. But he made no appeal. Both were burningly aware that unity had died so that they could be free, no barrier between them. Yet barrier there seemed to be, invisible, inscrutable. Once Sir Oliver, who had joined them in the garden, asked, "What are your plans for the future, my boy?" "Plans? I have none. Just the same old round of work."
"I mean your domestic arrangements."
"I'll go on living with my old aunt. We're a queer couple, I suppose, but we understand each other."
"Ugh,"
grunted Sir Oliver, and he went away to tie up a drooping rose. They walked on in dead silence, which was broken at last by John, who made a remark as to Constable's growing infirmities. So the visit came to an end without a word having been said, and John went back to his desolate house, physically rested and able to take up the routine of his working life. Herold in Switzerland wrote letters about snows and glaciers and crystal air. The calm tenor of existence was resumed at the Channel House. Incidentally, Stella found an occupation. Old Dr. Ransom, in casual talk, mentioned a case of great poverty and sickness in the village. Stella, followed by Morris bearing baskets of luxuries, presented herself at the poor house in the character of Lady Bountiful. At the sight that met her eyes, she wept and went away sorrowful, and then it dawned upon her inexperienced soul that gifts costing her nothing, although they had their use, might be supplemented by something vastly more efficacious. She consulted the hard-worked district nurse, and, visiting the house again, learned how to tend the sick woman, and wash the babies, and bring cleanliness and air and comfort into the miserable place. And having made in this way the discovery that all through her life she had accepted service from all and sundry, and never done a hand's turn for anybody, she plunged with young shame and enthusiasm into the new work. Afraid lest convalescence on the part of the patient would throw her back into idleness, She ingenuously asked the nurse if there were other poor people in Southcliff who needed help. The nurse smiled. Even at Southcliff there was enough work among the poor and needy for every day in the week, the whole year round. "I'm glad," said Stellamaris. Then she checked herself. "No, I can't be. I'm dreadfully sorry." The little lines of complexity knit themselves on her brow. "It's a confusing world, isn't it?" The state of mind of Stellamaris at this period may be best described as one of suspended judgment. It was a confusing world. She could not pronounce a more definite opinion. The land of illusion was a lost Atlantis of which not a speck remained. On the other hand, the world was no longer the mere abode of sin and ugliness and horror to which she had gradually awakened. Unity had taught her that. What, then, was this mysterious complication of life in which she found herself involved? It no longer frightened her, it interested her curiously. "Excellency, dear," she said one day, "are there any books about life?" He stared at her, covering his non-comprehension with the usual military twirl of his moustache.
"Millions? What kind of life?"
"Life itself, the meaning of it."
"Religious books? I'm afraid they're not in my line, my dear."
"I don't think it's religious books I want," said Stella.
"Philosophy, then. Kant, Schopenhauer,
He hooked a name from the depths of his memory.
Bain, and all those fellows. I could never make head or tail of them myself, so I don't suppose you could, dear."
"Did you say Kant? I think I've seen a book of his in the library." She pulled down a dusty volume of the Critique of Pure Reason from a top shelf, and puzzled her young brains over it. It seemed to be dealing with vital questions, but like Sir Oliver she was hopelessly befogged. She asked the old doctor. He had a glimmering of her meaning.
The best book in the world, my dear," he waved a hand, "is life itself."
"But I can't read it without a dictionary, Doctor," she objected.
"Your heart, my child," said he.
This was pretty, but not satisfactory. Walter could tell me, she said to herself, and forthwith wrote him a long letter. She lived in a state not only of suspended judgment, but also suspended emotion. The latter hung in the more delicate balance. Her maidenhood realized it vaguely. She had half expected John to speak of his love for her. At the same time she dreaded the moment of declaration, and at the same time also she felt that beneath the shadow of the wings of death it behoved mortal passion to lie still and to veiled. The anguish of the weeks preceding the tragedy had passed away. She had no pain save that of yearning pity for an agonized world. The old people in their dependence on her and in the pathos of their limited vision once more became inexpressibly dear. The childish titles were invested in a new beauty. Her pretty labours in sorrow-stricken cottages, amateurish as they were, had a profound significance. Unlike the thousands of sweet English girls up and down the land who are bred in the practice of philanthropy and think no more of it than of its concomitant tennis parties and flirtations, she had come upon it unawares, and it had all the thrill of a discovery. It was one little piece fitted certainly into the baffling puzzle of life. John came down again for the week-end. Stella found him gentle, less gloomy, but oddly remote from her, remoter even than when he lay crushed beneath the tragedy. Now and again she caught him looking at her wistfully, whereupon she turned her eyes away in a distress which she could not explain. Gradually she became aware that the great high-belovedest of the past had vanished into nothingness, with so many other illusory things. The awakening kiss that he had given her as he carried her in his arms faded into the far-off dreamland. On the Sunday night they lingered in the drawing-room for a moment after the old people had retired to bed. "I must be going back by the early train in the morning, and shan't see you," said he, "so I'll say good-bye now." "I'm sorry, dear." She put out her hand. "I hope the little change has done you good." For answer, he bent down and touched her forehead with his lips. Then he held the door open for her to pass out. "God bless you, dear," said he. She went upstairs, feeling in a half-scared way that something, she knew not what, had happened, and she cried herself to sleep. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Stellamaris by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. It was a sullen night in mid-August, following a breathless day and an angry sunset that had shed a copper-coloured glow above a bank of cloud. The great windows of the drawing-room of the Channel House were flung open wide, and on the terrace beneath the starless heaven sat the little group of intimates, which now included the placid lady of the little Kilburn house. Walter Herold, who had returned from Switzerland tanned and strong, told his adventures to Sir Oliver and Dr. Ransom, while John and Stella, a little way apart, listened idly. Lady Blount and Miss Linden murmured irrelevancies concerning the curates of long ago and the present price of beef. They had many points at which the curves of their natures touched, such as mathematicians, with a unique spasm of romance, call points of osculation. But for the voices all was still. From below, at the base of the cliff, came the lazy lapping of the sea against the rocks. Outside the glow of light cast by the illuminated drawing-room, the world was pitch black. The air grew more and more oppressive. "I think there's going to be thunder," said Lady Blount. "I hope not," said Miss Linden. "I know John thinks it foolish, but I'm terribly afraid of thunder." "So does Sir Oliver, but I don't care. Whenever there's a thunderstorm, I go up to my room and put my head under the bedclothes until it's over." "Now, isn't that remarkable, my dear?" said Miss Linden. "I do exactly the same. I draw down the blinds and hide scissors away in a drawer and throw a woolen shawl over the steel fender, and then I put my head under the blankets. My Aunt Marjorie, I remember, invariably used to go and sit in the coal cellar, but she was a strong-minded woman and would put her foot on a black beetle as soon as look at it. I hope I'm fond of most of God's creatures, but a black beetle frightens me out of my wits." "What do you think of thunderstorms, Stella?" John asked, knocking the ashes out of his pipe. "I'm rather frightened," she confessed. "Not because I think they'll hurt me." She paused and sighed. "I never could understand them." "What do you mean by understanding a thunderstorm?" he asked. "I don't know," she answered. "You either understand things or you don't." Herold broke in to spare her further explanation. "There was a splendid one the week before last in the mountains, a real Walpurgisnacht. It seemed as though hell had broken loose." He described it in his vivid way. The elderly ladies looked at the glimmer of white shirt front and the glowing cigarette end, by which alone he was revealed, and wondered at the heroical, or as it seemed in the unconfessed depths of their souls, the God-defying qualities of male humanity. A few resounding splashes fell from the sky. The party rose hurriedly. "Gad, we're in for it!" cried Sir Oliver. "Let us get indoors." A flash of lightning rent the southern sky, and a clap of thunder broke over the channel, and the rain came down like a waterspout. In the drawing-room, Lady Blount put her hand before her eyes. "You must all forgive me. I can't stand it. I must go upstairs. Besides, it's late, very near bedtime. My dear Miss Linden, shall we go?" The two old ladies, after hasty good nights, retired to the protection of their respective bedclothes. A great wind arose and swept through the room, blowing over a vase of flowers on the piano. Dr. Ransom, who happened to be standing near, mopped up the water with his handkerchief. Herold sprang to the window and shut it. Stella was by his side. Another flash sped through the blackness, and the thunder followed. They drew near together and waited for the next. Sir Oliver hospitably pushed John and the old doctor towards the drawing-room door. "There are drinks in the library. It'll be cosier there, on the other side of the house, away from this confounded racket. Come along, Walter. Stella, darling, you'd better go to bed. It's the best place for little girls in a thunderstorm." She turned, the breadth of the drawing-room separating Walter Herold and herself from the others. "I'll stay up a little longer and look at it, dear Excellency," she said with a smile. "I'll come into the library later and tell you all good night." At this announcement, and Stellamaris's announcement had ever been sovereign decrees, John and Dr. Ransom, standing by the open door, obeyed the courteous wave of Sir Oliver's hand. After a livid revelation of elemental welter and the deafening crash of cataclysm, she clutched his arm. When the peal had rolled away into an angry rumble, he whispered, "Are you frightened?" "No," she replied, also below her breath. "Not frightened. It excites me. It makes me feel. It makes me think. I seem to be understanding things I never understood before. Don't let her speak." To remove impression of rebuke, her hand slid down his arm. found his hand, and held it. Neither spoke. After a while he scanned her face by the lightning. It was set as though she saw a vision, her eyes gleaming, her lips parted. At the thunderclap her grasp involuntarily tightened. Again and again her face was startlingly visible. Herold's mind went back down the years. He had seen that rapt expression times without number when she lay by the window of her sea-chamber and looked out into the mysteries of sea and sky, and times without number she had held his hand while her spirit, as he had loved fantastically to believe, went forth to dance with her sisters of the foam, or to walk secure through the gates of the sunset. And he had loved to believe, too, that his own spirit, in some blind, attendant way, though lagging far behind, followed hers over the borders of the land that never was. Sensitive to her moods, he felt now a strange excitement. She had become once more the Stellamaris of the cloudless and mystical years. The sea that had rejected her had again claimed her for its own, and was delivering into her keeping mysteries such as it had withheld from her even then. For she had found no message in the war of elements, mysterious, deep, and magnificent. He returned her tense pressure, and followed her spirit out into the vastness. The storm grew fiercer. Every few moments spasms of livid daylight rent the darkness and dazzlingly illuminated the eager faces of the pair. The window jambs and transoms, the terrace, the howling waste beyond, the skeleton ship tossing grimly, the promontory, the pitch black of the sky. And the thunder burst in awful detonations over their heads. Unconsciously and instinctively, Stellamaris had drawn nearer to him, and her arm rested against his. After a long time in the stillness of the dark, he spoke like one in a dream. "The terrible splendour of life, that is the secret. The terrible splendour." She woke almost with a shock, and turning round shook him by the lapel of his coat. "How did you know, Walter? How did you know?" Her voice quavered. He felt that she was trembling. A flash showed her straining eyes into his face. They waited for the thunderclap during a second of intensity. "What?" he asked. "Those words, those very words had just come to me. The meaning of everything. The terrible splendour of life. How did you know?" "It was our souls that were going together through the storm." She released him and withdrew a little. "Did you know all that I was thinking?" "Of all that the sea was telling you." "Did you feel that too?" she asked breathlessly. "I think so," he replied. "It was strange," she said. "I hardly knew that I was here. I seemed to be away in the midst of it all, but I don't think I lost consciousness. I had adventures, curious adventures." She paused abruptly, then continued. "They seemed to be definite then, but they're all a blur now. It was a kind of battle between man and evil forces, and I think I felt a voice speaking through it and saying that the splendour of man would never be subdued. And the impression I've got is that I saw something. Whether it was a shape or a scene, I don't know, but something great and grand and fierce and heroic. And the voice told me it was life. The only thing I have clear is the words, the terrible splendour of life. The words you plucked out of me." "It is the great secret," he said. "Yes." There was another silence. The storm began to pass gradually away. The lightning became rarer, and the intervals longer between flash and thunder. "It's beginning to clear," she said at last. "All that has troubled me, all that you guessed I was feeling, and that I told you of only when you compelled me. You've been right. Once, do you remember, you said that if I saw God through the beauty and the vanity of the world, all would be well." "I ought to have told you to see him through the pain of the world," said Herold. "You have told me that, in other words, ever since, and I was deaf." "Not I, dear," said Herold. "Yes, you. Now I understand." She drew a deep breath. "Now I understand. It's like an open book. That woman, Unity. Wait." She paused, and put her two hands to her head in the darkness. "I have a glimmer of a memory. It's so elusive. It seems that I saw Unity just now. I understand all that she was, all that she meant." A flash showed the sea. "Yes, I was out there," she cried excitedly, and pointed. "Just out there." Darkness engulfed them. I forget, she faltered. I forget.
But the sea has taken you back at last, Stellamaris, said Herold.
She seized his hand and held it during the peal. Then she cried in a tone of sudden terror, "Walter!" "Yes?" "What you said, your prophecy, the comfort of the sea, the deeper meaning?" He leaped to his feet.
"Don't think anything more of it. They were just foolish words to comfort you. You and I seem to have been on the edge of beyond and looked over. We're not quite normal. We must get down now to practical things. I'm just what I always was, dear, a fantastic person who rode with you into fairyland. I am still, nothing more."
"Are you quite sure?" suddenly asked a deep voice out of the blackness of the room. Stella, with a little cry of fright, sprang to Herold for protection. For a second or two they were still. In their exultation, the question seemed to come from some vast depth of the abysm of time. Their hearts beat fast, and they clung together, listening, and there was not a sound. Then the lightning played its dancing daylight about the room, and they saw John Risca standing by the door. They sprang apart. In another moment the room was flooded with electric light. The drawing-room, for all its beauty, looked mean and unimportant. The lights showed up glaringly in old Florentine tapestry over the chimney-piece. It seemed to have singularly little relation to life. It jarred impertinently. "I came in to find Walter," said John. "I didn't think Stella was still up. It's late. You didn't hear me. I'm sorry I inadvertently overheard."
"There's nothing, my dear John, that you could not have heard," said Herold.
John came forward in his lumbering way. "I know that, Walter." For a minute or two no one spoke. The three stood stock-still, their hearts thumping. Outside the rain fell pitilessly on the flags of the terrace, and the waning storm flashed and growled. John's burning eyes looked at Herold beneath heavy knitted brows. At last he said, "You love Stella. You have loved her always. You never told me."
"That is not so," said Herold. "You found us in a foolishly false position. A thunderstorm is an emotional piece of business. My old intimacy with Stella has its privileges. I'll leave you. Stella will speak for herself."
John stretched out a detaining arm. "No, my friend, stay. We three must have a talk together. It was bound to come sooner or later. Let it be now." He spoke quietly, with dignity and authority.
"There is nothing for us to talk about," said Herold.
Stellamaris stood clutching the back of an armchair and looking from one man to the other.
"The words you overheard ought to tell you that, and in answer to your question, I can say that I am quite sure."
"You lie," said John quietly. "You lie out of the loyalty of your heart." He raised his great hand to check the other's outburst. "God Almighty in heaven knows I'm not accusing you. If ever man had deep and devoted and unselfish love from another, I've had it from you, and I have it still. It's a matter not of reproach, but of reparation."
"Don't you think," said Herold, "we might continue this extraordinary conversation in the library by ourselves?"
"No," said John, in the obstinate tone that Herold had known for many years. "You and I are two men, and Stella is a woman, and a hell mess just like that," he pointed to the Tempest, "has upset our lives. It's time to put them to rights again."
"I don't know what you're talking about," said Herold. "It's a pity you've chosen tonight. Things are a bit abnormal. Let us go to bed and talk tomorrow, if you like, in the light of common sense."
John folded his arms. "I'm going to talk tonight. I want you calmly to consider the position."
"I do," said Herold. "Stop," as John was about to interrupt. "Let me speak."
"Yes," said Stella, breaking silence for the first time. "Let Walter speak." But she stood apart, fascinated by this strange duel, as her primitive ancestress might have done when two males fought for her with flint-headed axes.
"What I feel as regards Stella is neither here nor there. I've never told you that I loved her. I've never told you. Both you and she have told me that you love each other. That was enough for me. I joined with Unity in seeking to remove the obstacle in the path of your happiness. If Unity had not forestalled me, well, God knows what I should have done. I left you to sleep that evening, and went, half crazy, to the flat, and there I found what I found. But anyhow,
Unity committed murder and suicide to set the two of you free. If you want strong, blatant words, there you have them. A girl, one of God's chosen, has laid down her life for the two of you." He stood between them and threw up his hands. "Take each other. It is a sacrament." Stella, her arms still on the back of the chair, hung her head and stared downward. John cast a quick glance at her, and then, a thing which he rarely did, drew his great frame up to its full height and challenged his friend. "If you don't love her, she loves you. I know."
Herold said, "You two belong to each other."
"Then Stella must decide," said John. She threw out a flutter of delicate fingers and covered her face. "No, no," she gasped. The lightning flickered mildly in the well-lit room, and the eventual thunder reverberated in distant anger. John again came close to Herold. "This may be an extraordinary conversation, but it has to be. If Stella loved me, do you think she would stand like that?" Stella dropped to her knees, her face and arms huddled against the chair. "My dear old man, I've learned many things of late. I can't tell you exactly. I'm not good at that sort of thing. But Unity has been too big for me." Stella raised a white face. "What do you mean? Say exactly what you mean." "I mean, oh, God knows what I mean." He strode blindly across the room, returned, and faced the two, still near together. "Can't you understand?" he cried with a wide gesture. "I'm infinitesimal sand beneath that child's feet. I'm a blind mole in comparison with her transcendent vision. I'm in the dust. Oh, God!" He turned away. Stella rose, and, clasping hands to her bosom, went to him. "Belovedest, for Christ's sake, what is the end of all this?" He halted and took her hands. "Not shadows, not lies. Once I thought, indeed I knew, you loved me. That was when you were an ignorant child. You loved someone you thought was me. Now your eyes are opened. You have passed through flames. Knowledge has come to you. You see me as I am, and your love has gone. I know, too, what I am. Unity has taught me. You don't love me, Stella. That I know. I've known it ever since that day when we put her into her grave." Herold came between them imploringly.
"My dear man, my dear fellow, what is the use of this wild talk? You two love each other. Unity gave her life for the two of you. If you two don't come together, it's all overwhelming, blasting irony. I couldn't believe in God after it. It would be hellishly cynical. Stella, in God's name, tell him that you are bound by Unity's sacrifice, that you love him and will marry him and make his life happy."
Stella, very pale, looked at John. "If you want me, I will marry you," she said in a clear voice. John waved her aside. "I will not take you, my dear," said he. Spurned sex winced involuntarily. "If you have stopped caring for me—" "I stopped caring? I? Merciful God, I've never loved you so much. But you love a better man. What's the good of saying the same things over and over again? But I'll tell you this, both of you, that if Unity had not given her life, and if I had been free, I should have fought for you and had you despite everything. That's my accursed nature. But Unity has not died in vain, and it's because of that child's death, the beauty and heroism of it, that I'm able to stand here and tear my heart out and throw it away. Don't make any mistake," he turned fiercely on Herold. "It's not I who am giving her up. It's Unity."
"Very well," said Herold. "Let us put it at that. It's your point of view. You also force me to speak. It would be grotesque to keep silence any longer. Yes, I do love her. She is the beginning and end of life to me. If she had lain on her back all her days, I should never have married another woman. There, you have it now."
The two men's eyes held each other for a space. Stellamaris looked at the pair with a fearful admiration. They were men. Herold she had divined and known long ago. This, on his part, was only the supreme fulfilment of promise. But John Risca, who had passed through the illusion and disillusion of her soul, stood before her in new strength, a great and moving figure. At last John drew a deep breath, turned to Stellamaris very gently, and smiled. "And you?" The smile sent swift pain through her heart. She made a step or two, and fell sobbing on his breast. "Oh, belovedest, I'm sorry. You've guessed right. Forgive me." He caressed the bowed head tenderly for an instant. Then, releasing himself, he clapped his hand on Herold's shoulder and shook it with rough affection. "I'm going to bed," said he. He moved to the door. There he paused to nod a good night, but sight of them both looking sadly at him, he walked back a couple of paces. "Don't worry about me. I'm at peace with myself for the first time for years. There's a lot of happiness in the world left." He smiled again. "Enough for the three of us, and for Unity." He left them and went to bed in the room which Stellamaris had furnished for him long ago, and fell into the sleep of the man who has found rest at last in the calm and certain knowledge of spiritual things. Unity had not died in vain. And Stellamaris, sitting once more by Herold's side in the wide bay of the window, and talking with him in a hushed voice of the wondrous things that had come to pass, knew that John Risca had spoken a great truth. It had been God's will that so should the terrible splendour of the world be made manifest. Herold asked for the million-billionth time in the history of mankind, "When did you first find that you loved me?" She replied, perhaps more truly than most maidens, "There was never a time when I didn't love you. I don't quite know what I mean," she said confusedly. "You see, I've lived a strange life, dear," she went on. "You seem to have been a part of me ever since I can remember what is worth remembering. You have always understood things that went on inside me almost before I could tell them to you. I always wanted you to explain foolishness that I couldn't speak of to anyone else." "That's very beautiful," Herold interrupted, "but love is a different matter. When did the real love come to you?" "I think it was that morning in the garden when you almost whipped me," said Stella. She started an inch or two away from him. "And I'm sure you knew it," she said. And he remembered, as he had often remembered in his great struggle, her eyes turning from agates to diamonds, and her words, "Do you love me like that?" "Heaven knows, Stellamaris dear, I did not mean to betray myself." She laughed, the enigmatic laugh of a woman's contentment, and Herold was too wise to ask why. They spoke of deepest things. "There is something I must tell you," said he, "which up to now I have had to keep secret, and it is right that you should know." And he told her the story of Unity and himself, the revolver, their talk of the evil woman, their parting words, his crazed adventure through the sunny streets. She listened, her body leaning forward, her hands clasped on her knee. When he had finished, she sat without change of attitude. "You did that so that another man could marry the woman you loved. Unity did that so that the man she loved could marry another woman. John came in tonight to sacrifice himself and give us both happiness. The three of you have done terrible and splendid things. I am the only one of us four who has done nothing." Herold rose, took a nervous pace or two. What she said needed more than a lover's sophistical reassurance. He could speak 1,000 words of comfort, but he knew that her soul required a supreme answer, a clue to the dark labyrinth through which she had worked. What could he say? He looked through the window and suddenly saw that which to him was an inspiration. He threw the folding doors wide. It had stopped raining long ago, though neither had noticed. "Come out on the terrace," said he. She followed him into the gusty air. The sea still roared resentfully at the late disturbance of its quiet. The southwest wind that had brought up the storm had driven the great rack of black cloud above the horizon, and there below the rack was a band of dark but cloudless sky, and in it one star hung serene. Herold pointed to it. "Have you done, dear?" His voice broke in a catch of exultation, and his usually nimble wit failed to grasp the lunatic falsity of the analogy. "You have done what that has done. Come through the storm pure and steadfast." "Not I, dear," she said, but my faith in the God we breathe.
No, you yourself.
He put his arm around her, and all his love spoke.
You,
the living mystery of beauty that is you. He whispered into her lips, You, Stellamaris, star of the sea. End of chapter 25. End of Stellamaris by William John Locke.